Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Dr. Ethan Keller stood at the observation window, watching the stars pass by in endless patterns of light and shadow. The life ark glided silently through the vast emptiness, a beacon of hope in the cold, indifferent void of space. The ship was massive, capable of housing entire communities in its cavernous medical wings, yet tonight, it felt small, too small for the burden Ethan now carried on his aging shoulders. He rubbed his temples, feeling the tension thrumming through him. Decades of work on this ship, traveling from one devastated world to another, treating the wounded and the sick, had given him many sleepless nights. But this was different. The message had come in only a few hours ago. The Zilorans, a species living on a far-flung, war-torn planet, were on the brink of extinction. "Ethan, are you still awake?" Captain Nora Wade's voice crackled through the comm link, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, turning away from the window. "Too much on my mind." "I figured as much," she said. "I just wanted to remind you that we'll be arriving at Zilara in 6 hours. Get some rest if you can. We're going to need you sharp for this one." Ethan nodded, even though he knew she couldn't see him. "Thanks, Nora, I'll try." He disconnected the comm and headed toward the med bay. Rest was impossible now. His mind raced with thoughts of the Zilorans, the genetic disorder ravaging their population, and the limited supplies on board the life ark. How could they save an entire species with so little to work with? As he passed through the corridors of the ship, he saw the faces of his crew, exhausted, determined, many of them much younger than him. Dr. Ava Mira, the enthusiastic young doctor who had joined the life ark only 5 years ago, smiled tiredly as she saw him approach. "Still up, Doc?" she asked, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Same as you," he replied, his tone weary. "How are the patients from Sirith holding up?" "They're stable, for now. But I don't know how much longer our supplies will last." "We're down to half of what we had before the Sirith mission." Ethan nodded grimly. The Sirithians, a peaceful race who had suffered the fallout of a neighboring planet's war, had been on the brink of annihilation when the life ark arrived. They'd managed to save most of the survivors, but the cost had been too high, perhaps. Now, with the Zilorans facing a similar fate, the crew's resources were nearly exhausted. "We'll find a way," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Ava looked at him, her eyes filled with both admiration and concern. "If anyone can figure this out, it's you, Dr. Keller." He forced a smile. "Let's hope you're right." They both knew the stakes. The Zilorans weren't just facing a medical crisis, they were facing extinction. The genetic disorder that had spread through their population was unlike anything the life ark had encountered before. It attacked their DNA at the cellular level, causing organ failure and rapid degeneration. Every newborn was affected, and the older generations were dying faster than they could be treated. Ethan spent the next few hours reviewing the Zilorans' medical files, trying to formulate a plan. The genetic therapy that Ava had suggested was risky, but it might be their only chance. The problem was that the therapy required resources they didn't have not anymore. The Sirith mission had drained their reserves, and now they were operating on fumes. As the ship approached Zilara, Ethan felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had always prided himself on being a doctor first and foremost. His duty was to save lives, no matter the cost. But now, with limited supplies and an entire species depending on him, he wasn't sure what the right choice was. The life ark entered orbit around Zilara, and the desolation of the planet below came into sharp focus. The once thriving cities were now crumbled ruins, the landscape scarred by decades of war. The air was thick with toxic pollutants, and the remaining Zilorans had retreated to underground bunkers, clinging to the last vestiges of life. Ethan and Ava suited up, preparing to descend to the planet's surface with a small medical team. Captain Wade had insisted on sending a security detail along with Ava. Zilara was still a volatile place, and there were reports of rogue factions roaming the wasteland. As they touched down in the main settlement, Ethan was struck by the eerie silence. The bunker was a sterile, lifeless place, its inhabitants barely moving as they huddled in small groups. Their skin was pale, their eyes sunken. The genetic disorder had ravaged them, leaving them fragile, almost ghost-like. Elder Lothar, the leader of the Zilrans, greeted them with a solemn nod. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though each step cost him great effort. "Thank you for coming," Lothar said, his voice thin and raspy. "We feared we were beyond saving." "We're here to help," Ethan replied, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure how much help they could actually offer. Lothar led them deeper into the bunker, where the Zilrans sick and dying lay in makeshift beds. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the low hum of medical machines filled the room. Ethan's heart sank as he looked at the patients. So many of them were children, their small bodies already succumbing to the disease. "We've been fighting this for years," Lothar explained. "Our scientists tried everything, but nothing worked. We're running out of time." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. The genetic therapy could work, but it would take days and maybe weeks, and there was no guarantee that they had enough supplies to treat everyone. He glanced at Tava, who was already moving from bed to bed, checking vital signs and assessing the patients. "We'll do what we can," Ethan said, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. What could they really do? The next few days were a blur of activity. Ethan and his team worked tirelessly, administering treatment to as many Zilrans as they could. The genetic therapy was showing promise in the initial patients, but the clock was ticking. Supplies were running dangerously low, and Captain Wade was becoming increasingly anxious. "We can't stay here much longer, Ethan," she said during one of their brief check-ins. "The ship's systems are strained, and if we don't resupply soon, we'll be in trouble." "I know," he replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "But we're not done here." "Not yet." Wade's face hardened. "You're risking everything for a species that might not survive. I need you to be realistic about this." "I am realistic," Ethan shot back, his voice tight with frustration. "But I can't just walk away." The tension between them simmered, unspoken but palpable. Ethan knew Wade was right in a sense. They couldn't save everyone, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon the Zilrans. Not when they were so close to a breakthrough. One evening, as Ethan was making his rounds, he met a young Zilran girl named Ilari. She was only 8 years old, her body frail and weak from the disease, but her spirit was strong. She reminded him of his daughter, long gone now but never far from his thoughts. Ilari smiled up at him, her large eyes full of curiosity. "Will I get better, Doctor?" Ethan crouched beside her bed, his heart aching. "We're doing everything we can to make sure you do." She nodded, her little hand reaching for his. He took it gently, feeling the warmth of her fragile skin. "Thank you," she whispered. In that moment, Ethan knew he couldn't give up. He couldn't let this child and so many others die because of a lack of supplies or time. He had to find a way, no matter the cost. As the days wore on, the strain on the Life Ark became more apparent. The crew was exhausted, supplies were critically low, and the genetic therapy was taking longer than expected. But slowly, miraculously, the Zilrans were starting to recover. The therapy was working, but the cost was staggering. But as Dr. Keller looked over the ship's dwindling supply logs, a gnawing sense of dread settled deep in his chest. The Life Ark had reached its limit. Medical resources had been stretched to the breaking point, and every decision moving forward would be one of sacrifice. His mind buzzed with the weight of it all. It wasn't just a matter of curing the Zilrans anymore. The entire crew of the Life Ark was at risk if they stayed much longer without resupplying. Captain Wade's sharp voice cut through his haze of thoughts as she approached. "Ethan, we have to talk," she said, arms crossed, her eyes hard with the frustration of a woman who'd spent her life in tough command decisions. "We're out of time," he sighed, not looking at her. "I know." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "No, I don't think you do. We've got two choices: stay and finish this, risking the lives of everyone on board, or pull out now and cut our losses." Ethan turned to face her, exhaustion etched into every line on his face. And leave them to die? That's not who we are. Look around, she snapped, her patience fraying. We're bleeding dry, Ethan. The engines are failing, the environmental controls are compromised, and we're running out of medical supplies. We barely have enough to treat our own crew at this point. His jaw clenched as he tried to balance the needs of the few against the needs of the many. Wade wasn't wrong. The situation was dire, and the longer they stayed on Zillara, the greater the risk to the entire mission. But the thought of abandoning the Zillarans now, when they were finally starting to respond to treatment, was unbearable. I just need more time, he said quietly, almost to himself. Just a little more time. Captain Wade shook her head. You're asking for something I can't give. I have a duty to this ship, to this crew, and I won't let us die out here. Her words hung heavy in the air between them. Ethan knew the choice he was about to make would haunt him forever, regardless of the outcome. But as he glanced down the med bay and saw Ilari lying in her bed, her eyes closed in a peaceful sleep for the first time since they'd arrived, he made his decision. We stay, he said, his voice firmer now. We finish what we started. Captain Wade's eyes flared with anger. You're insane. This isn't some idealistic mission anymore, Ethan. This is survival. Exactly, he countered, standing his ground. And survival means saving lives, all lives. If we abandon them now, we lose more than supplies. We lose the very reason this ship exists. She stared at him for a long moment, her frustration giving way to something more resigned. You're going to get us killed, she muttered, turning on her heel and stalking out of the med bay. Ethan exhaled, long and slow, feeling the weight of his choice settle over him like a shroud. He knew there would be consequences, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was what he was meant to do, even if it cost them everything. The next few days were a blur of frantic work. Ethan and Ava threw themselves into the genetic therapy, pushing the boundaries of what their equipment could handle. The Zillarans' response was promising, with more and more of them stabilizing and showing signs of recovery. But the strain on the life arc was becoming more pronounced with each passing hour. Life support systems were operating on backup power, and the medical staff was running on little more than adrenaline and sheer will. Ethan caught only brief moments of sleep, his mind racing with the logistics of keeping everything afloat. Every beep from the ship's systems felt like a countdown to disaster. Then, on the fifth night after their arrival, the inevitable happened. A loud, jarring alarm pierced through the med bay, waking everyone. Ethan shot to his feet, heart pounding, as the lights flickered ominously. Ava ran to his side, wide-eyed with fear. What's happening? Before he could respond, Captain Wade's voice came through the ship-wide comms, tense but controlled. All hands to emergency stations. We've had a breach in the power grid. Life support is failing. Ethan's stomach dropped. This was the collapse they'd all been fearing. He grabbed Ava's arm and motioned for the rest of the team to follow. We need to stabilize the patients and secure them in the emergency pods. But the therapy, Ava began, panic in her voice. There's no time, he barked, harsher than he meant. We do what we can. They raced through the corridors as the ship groaned and shuddered around them. The power flickered again, casting eerie shadows along the walls. In the chaos, Ethan's mind raced. He knew if the life support systems failed completely, everyone on board, a crew and patients alike, would suffocate in a matter of minutes. As they reached the engineering bay, they found Matteo working frantically to reroute power. His face was grim, sweat pouring down his brow as he worked the controls. How bad is it? Ethan demanded. Matteo barely glanced up. We're hanging by a thread. I can give you 20 minutes, tops. Ethan nodded, grim but resolved. That's all we need. The next 20 minutes were a frenzy of movement. Ava and the rest of the med team worked with surgical precision, securing patients and transferring those who were stable into the emergency pods. Every second felt like a lifetime as Ethan moved from bed to bed, checking vitals and ensuring that each Zilran had the best chance possible. Ilari was one of the last patients they moved. As Ethan gently lifted her frail body into the pod, her eyes fluttered open. "Doctor?" she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. He forced a reassuring smile, even as the ship trembled around them. "You're going to be okay, Ilari. We're going to get through this." She nodded weakly, her small hand gripping his for a moment before she drifted back into unconsciousness. With the patients secure, Ethan turned to the rest of his team. "Get to your stations, we have to ride this out." They scattered, each moving to their assigned posts. Ethan headed toward the command deck, where Captain Wade was already deep in conversation with Matteo. The tension in the air was palpable, but Wade's face was set in steely determination. "We've stabilized for now," she said without looking at him. "But we're running on fumes. If we don't get out of here soon, this ship's going to tear itself apart." Ethan nodded, feeling the full weight of his decision pressing down on him. They had pushed the life arc to its limit, and now they were paying the price. For a brief moment, silence fell over the ship, broken only by the soft hum of emergency systems. Then, with a shuddering groan, the ship's lights flickered back to life. Matteo let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "We've got partial power," he said, his voice tight with relief. "But it won't last long." Captain Wade's gaze flicked to Ethan. "We need to leave now." Ethan didn't argue. They had done everything they could. It was time to go. As the life arc lifted off from Zalara, leaving the broken planet behind, Ethan stood by the observation window, staring out into the cold expanse of space. The Zolrans were Safia for now, but the cost had been great, and the life arc was a shadow of its former self. Captain Wade joined him, her expression unreadable. "You saved them," she said quietly. Ethan didn't respond right away. His mind was still spinning with the enormity of what they had done and what they had lost. "At what cost?" Wade was silent for a long moment. Then, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, the cost is the price we pay to stay human." Ethan nodded slowly, knowing that her words were true. But as the stars streaked by outside the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had come perilously close to losing everything. The Zolrans would live, but the life arc's journey had taken a toll. And deep down, Ethan knew that this mission would haunt him for the rest of his days. The choices, the sacrifices, the lives saved and lost, it all blurred together in the endless vastness of space, where hope and despair often walked hand in hand. The life arc drifted onward, still searching for the next place in need of salvation, its crew forever changed by what they had left behind. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The clinic was quiet, its usual hum of activity stilled in the late hour. Adrian Cole sat at his desk, the gentle glow of the monitor illuminating the darkened room. He massaged his temples, exhaustion gnawing at his bones after another long day of healing broken minds. Soul healing was unlike anything else. Physicians could repair broken bones, replace faulty organs, but only a soul healer could mend the wounds that lay beneath the surface of the flesh. Adrian glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight, but his thoughts were still racing, pulled in different directions by the various patients he had treated that day. He had helped a soldier recover from the mental scars of war, guided a mother through the loss of her child, and even helped a renowned artist rediscover the creativity that had been buried under layers of self-doubt and trauma. But tonight, one patient lingered in his mind more than the others. Elias. There was something different about him. Something that sent a chill down Adrian's spine every time he entered the man's subconscious. Most patients came with fractured memories, their souls fractured by trauma or grief, but Elias's soul was a broken bar dense, layered with complexities Adrian had never encountered before. Every time Adrian thought he had reached the core of Elias's suffering, another layer would unfold, revealing something even more enigmatic. He had never met someone whose soul held such vastness, such a sense of broken bar ancientness. Adrian shook his head, clearing the fog of thoughts. Elias wasn't the first difficult patient he had treated, and he wouldn't be the last. But this case felt different. Elias's memories didn't just feel personal, they felt larger, like they were woven into the fabric of something far greater. The sound of the door opening snapped Adrian out of his thoughts. He turned to see his assistant, Kara, standing in the doorway, her face illuminated by the soft light of the hallway. "Still here?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "You're going to wear yourself out if you keep this up." Adrian smiled faintly. "I'm fine, just thinking." Kara stepped into the room, her presence as always a soothing one. She had been with him for years, a steady hand in the whirlwind of their work. "Thinking about Elias?" "Yeah," Adrian admitted. "There's something about him, a broken bar, something I can't quite put my finger on. Every time I think I've made a breakthrough, something pulls me deeper." Kara sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "You think it's something more than just drama?" Adrian hesitated. He had considered the possibility before but had pushed it aside. The mind was a complicated thing, and memories can often feel larger than life when viewed from within the depths of a soul. But Elias's memories, or broken bar, they felt like they weren't just his own. They felt like they held the weight of the universe itself. "I don't know," Adrian finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think there's something buried deep in his mind. Something that shouldn't be there." Kara studied him for a moment before nodding. "Be careful, Adrian. You've seen what happens when you go too deep." He knew she was right. There were dangers to soul healing, boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. Diving too far into a person's subconscious could lead to psychic collapse, for both patient and healer. But Elias, a broken bar, something told Adrian that Elias's mind held more than just personal memories. "I will," he assured her, though the words felt hollow. As Kara left, Adrian turned back to his monitor, pulling up Elias's file. The man had come to him a few months ago, referred by a colleague. No family, no close friends. His background was a mystery, his file sparse. He claimed to have no memory of how he had arrived at the clinic, and his earliest recollections were hazy at best. Adrian leaned back in his chair, staring at the notes he had taken during their sessions. Each time they had delved into Elias's mind, they had uncovered strange, fragmented memories of distant worlds, ancient structures, and strange cosmic events. But the memories weren't cohesive. They felt like fragments of a dream, jumbled together without context. Adrian had tried to make sense of them, to help Elias piece together his past, but each session only seemed to raise more questions. And with every question, Adrian felt himself being drawn deeper into Elias's mind, like a moth to a flame. He sighed and stood up, walking over to the window. The city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling in the darkness. For all the advancements humanity had made, for all the technology and knowledge at their disposal, the mind remained one of the last true frontiers. Soul healing was still in its infancy, a practice that only a select few truly understood. Adrian was one of the best, but even he felt lost in the vastness of Elias's subconscious. Tomorrow, they would have another session, and this time, Adrian promised himself, he would go deeper. He would find out what lay at the heart of Elias's fragmented mind, no matter what it took. The next day, Adrian entered the treatment room, finding Elias already seated in the reclining chair, his eyes distant, as though he were already lost in his own thoughts. "How are you feeling today?" Adrian asked, taking his seat across from him. Elias blinked, focusing on Adrian as though he were seeing him for the first time. "The same," he replied, his voice soft. "Lost." Adrian nodded, pulling up his tablet to begin the session. "We're going to go deeper today," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I think we're close to something important." Elias's eyes flickered with something of fear, maybe, or perhaps resignation. "I don't know if I want to go deeper." Adrian paused, studying the man before him. Elias had always been cooperative during their sessions, but this hesitation was new. "You're afraid of what we might find?" "I'm afraid of what I already know," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. "There are things a broken bar buried in my mind that shouldn't be uncovered." Adrian's pulse quickened. "What kind of things?" Elias shook his head. "I don't know, just a broken bar. I feel it. Every time you bring me deeper, it's like I'm getting closer to something. A broken bar, something dangerous." Adrian leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Elias, if there's something dangerous in your mind, we need to understand it. I can help you, but we have to face it together." For a long moment, Elias said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said softly. "Let's go deeper." Adrian took a deep breath, steadying himself. He activated the neural interface, a thin band that wrapped around Elias's forehead, connecting his mind to the system. As always, the sensation of entering another person's subconscious was disorienting at first, a swirl of colors and sounds that gradually settled into a more cohesive form. Adrian found himself standing in a vast, empty field, the sky above him a deep shade of violet. This was Elias's mind, or at least a part of it. The field stretched out in all directions, an endless expanse of nothingness. But Adrian knew that somewhere, hidden within this landscape, were the fragments of Elias's memories. He began to walk, his steps silent against the soft ground. In the distance, he could see a faint shape, a structure, maybe, or a figure. He couldn't be sure. The mind was a fluid place, constantly shifting and reshaping itself. As Adrian approached, the shape became clearer, a tall, monolithic structure, its surface smooth and black, like polished stone. It stood alone in the field, an imposing presence that seemed to hum with energy. This was new. Adrian had never encountered anything like it in Elias's mind before. He reached out, placing a hand on the surface of the monolith. The moment his fingers made contact, a shock of energy surged through him, and the landscape around him shifted. The field dissolved, replaced by a swirling vortex of light and sound. Adrian staggered back, disoriented, but the monolith remained, unchanged. "What is this?" he murmured to himself, though he knew no one could hear him. Suddenly, the vortex settled, and Adrian found himself standing in a new place, a vast, ancient temple, its walls lined with intricate carvings that seemed to depict scenes from a forgotten era. In the center of the temple, a massive stone altar stood, and on it lay a figure, motionless, but alive. It was Elias. Adrian blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure lying on the altar was unmistakably Elias, but the man appeared younger, almost childlike in his vulnerability. He was still, eyes closed as if in deep sleep, but the faint rise and fall of his chest indicated life. A strange hum filled the air, a low vibration that Adrian could feel resonating deep within his chest. For a moment, Adrian hesitated. The monolithic structure had transported him here, but this was unlike anything he had encountered in any of his patients' minds before. This wasn't just a manifestation of trauma or some repressed memory. It felt a broken bar, alive, ancient, and far more powerful than any human experience should have allowed. He approached the altar slowly, his gaze darting between the carvings on the walls. The scenes depicted were cryptic, but they all shared a common theme, a celestial event, something vast and incomprehensible, involving stars, planets, and what appeared to be a cosmic storm. It was as though the carvings were telling the story of the universe itself. Adrian's breath hitched in his throat as the realization dawned on him that this place wasn't just a part of Elias's subconscious. It was something far greater, a repository, perhaps, of knowledge, of memory. Something that spanned across eons. "Elias," Adrian whispered, standing beside the altar. The figure stirred slightly, but his eyes remained closed. "Elias, can you hear me?" A soft groan escaped the man's lips, and slowly, his eyelids fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused, distant, as though he were looking through Adrian, not at him. "You shouldn't have come here," Elias said, his voice weak but filled with a strange authority. Adrian frowned, taken aback by the sudden shift in demeanor. "Where is here?" Elias, what is this place? Elias closed his eyes again, as if summoning the strength to speak. These broken bar is what remains of a time long before us, before humanity, before the stars themselves. You've seen the carvings, haven't you? You know now that this is more than just my mind. Adrian nodded slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a shiver down his spine. How did you come to carry this? Elias sighed, his chest rising and falling as though each breath was an effort. I was a broken bar just like you, once, a healer, a traveler of minds. But I went too far. I found a broken bar, something I shouldn't have. He opened his eyes again, locking his gaze with Adrian's. And now it's a part of me, a part of my soul, and because you've come this far, it's a part of you too. Adrian's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Elias sat up slowly, wincing with the effort. You've seen Ida, the cosmic storm, the origins of everything. This knowledge, a broken bar, it's too vast for one mind to hold. It will tear you apart, Adrian, if you're not careful. The weight of Elias's words hit Adrian like a blow. He had felt Ida, the sheer magnitude of the knowledge contained in this place. It wasn't meant for a single mind, let alone a human one. It was like trying to hold the entire universe in the palm of your hand. Impossible. But a broken bar, what is it? What's the secret? Adrian asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and fear. Elias's expression darkened. It's the origin of the universe, of life, of consciousness. It's the force that gave birth to everything we know and everything we don't, and it's sentient. It's aware, Adrian. Adrian took a step back, his heart pounding in his ears. Are you saying this force, a broken bar, this entity, a broken bar, it's alive? Elias nodded grimly. Alive, and watching, waiting. It's been dormant for eons, but if disturbed at a broken bar, it could reshape everything. Reality as we know it could collapse. Adrian's mind raced. The implications of this were staggering. If this entity truly existed, if it held the power to reshape reality, then Elias's memories were a ticking time bomb. But that wasn't the worst part. Adrian had glimpsed it, had touched it, and now, it was inside him too. What do we do? Adrian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias looked up at him, his gaze filled with a sorrow so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. There's nothing you can do. Once you've touched it, there's no going back. It's part of you now. But a broken bar, he hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. You can keep it dormant, you can keep it from waking. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest. How? Elias reached out and placed a hand on Adrian's arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who seemed so weak moments ago. You have to leave it alone, don't dig any deeper. Don't let it consume you, because if you do, it will consume everything. Adrian stared at him, torn between disbelief and dread. He had come here to heal Elias, to uncover the root of his trauma. But now it seemed like he had stumbled upon something far more dangerous, something that threatened not just Elias's life, but the very fabric of the universe. I don't understand, Adrian said, shaking his head. Why would these a broken bar force be inside your mind? Why you? Elias closed his eyes again, leaning back against the stone altar. I don't know. I was chosen, I think. Or maybe I wasn't chosen at all. Maybe it's just a cosmic accident. But it's here now, and I have to live with it. We both do. Adrian swallowed hard, the weight of Elias's words pressing down on him like a physical force. He had never felt so helpless in his life. He was a healer, trained to help others, to fix what was broken. But these a broken bar, this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. I can't just leave it like this, Adrian said, his voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and fear. There has to be something I can do. Elias shook his head slowly. There's nothing, not unless you want to risk waking it. Adrian stood there, his mind racing. He couldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't just leave Elias to bear this burden alone. But at the same time, he knew Elias was right. The risk was too great. If this force was as powerful as Elias said, then tampering with it could have catastrophic consequences. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the temple was heavy, oppressive, as though the very air was waiting for something to happen. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "You have to go, Adrian. Leave me here. Forget what you've seen." Adrian stared at him, his heart aching with the weight of the decision before him. He didn't want to leave. He didn't want to abandon Elias to this fate. But he also knew that staying, digging deeper, could lead to something far worse. Slowly, reluctantly, Adrian nodded. "I'll go. But I won't forget." Elias gave him a sad smile. "I know you won't." With that, the temple around them began to fade, the ancient carvings and the stone altar dissolving into mist. Adrian felt himself being pulled back, out of the depths of Elias's mind, back to the surface. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the treatment room, sitting across from Elias, who was slumped in his chair, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady. For a long moment, Adrian just sat there, staring at the man before him. He had come so close to uncovering something unimaginable, something that could have changed everything. But in the end, he had pulled back. He had made the choice to leave it alone. But even as he sat there, a nagging thought tugged at the back of his mind. The secret was still there, buried deep within Elias's subconscious. And now, it was buried in Adrian's mind too. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. But Adrian knew he had to carry it. He had to protect it, to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. Because if it ever got out, if anyone ever discovered the broken bar, he couldn't finish the thought. The implications were too terrifying to consider. As Adrian stood to leave the room, Elias stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Adrian with a knowing expression, his voice barely a whisper. "Be careful, Adrian." "You're carrying it now." Adrian nodded, his throat tight. "I will." And with that, he walked out of the room, leaving Elias behind. But as he stepped into the hallway, the weight of the knowledge he carried pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He had made the choice to leave it alone. But some part of him knew that the secret wouldn't stay buried forever. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The sky was a dull, grayish-black sheet, oppressive and endless, hanging above the forgotten planet as if it had never seen the light of day. The wind howled, carrying with it grains of alien dust that stung at the skin. Dr. Miriam Royce pulled her jacket tighter, eyes squinting through the visor of her helmet as she surveyed the barren landscape stretching before her. "We're approaching the site," came a voice in her earpiece. It was Specialist Laura King, the xenobiologist assigned to the expedition, her voice tinged with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Miriam nodded, even though she knew Laura couldn't see it. She glanced back at the rest of the team of 5 in total, each clad in the same weather-beaten suits designed to withstand the harsh environment of this desolate place. They trudged forward in silence, their boots sinking into the ashen ground with each step. Ancient ruins jutted from the earth like jagged teeth, remnants of a civilization long gone. No one knew exactly what had happened here, but the whispers across the galactic scientific community had been enough to fund this expedition. As they neared the entrance of what appeared to be the main structure, the eerie stillness of the place gnawed at Miriam. There was no life, no sound other than the incessant wind. It felt like a graveyard, but one far too large to be understood by human comprehension. The ruins themselves seemed alive in a while watching. "Let's get this over with," Professor Langston muttered, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. He had been the first to sign on for the mission, eager for the prestige such a discovery could bring. "The faster we get to the bottom of this, the faster we leave." Miriam led the way, her flashlight cutting through the dim light as they descended into the mouth of the ruins. The entrance was enormous, built for beings far larger than humans. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply, and the walls were lined with intricate carvings, strange symbols that none of them could read. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. "These markings," Laura whispered, her gloved fingers tracing the patterns. They organic. They seem to shift when you look at them from different angles. They're just carvings, Langston grunted, already moving further into the ruin. Don't start with the alien mystic nonsense. But Miriam paused, studying the walls. Laura was right, the carvings seemed to pulse, like veins under a surface, moving subtly when you weren't directly looking. She shook off the discomfort that pricked at her mind and followed the others into the heart of the ruins. The deeper they went, the stranger the place became. The architecture was both familiar and otherworldly. Massive stone arches, narrow passageways, and wide halls, all filled with the same disquieting symbols. They found no signs of the civilization that once thrived here, only empty, echoing spaces. After hours of exploring, they reached the central chamber, a massive hall with a domed ceiling that stretched impossibly high. In the center stood what appeared to be statues, towering figures of the alien species they had come to study, the Zyrak. They were grotesque, with spindly limbs and elongated heads, their mouths open in silent screams. It was unnerving how lifelike they appeared. "These can't just be statues," said Engineer Yates, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Look at the detail. It's like they were frozen in place." "No signs of life," Laura muttered, scanning her handheld device. "Not in any traditional sense, at least." Dr. Royce circled the statues, eyes narrowing as she noticed a large, organic-looking artifact at the base of one. It pulsed faintly, a soft glow emanating from within, like a heartbeat beneath flesh. The rest of the team gathered around it, each of them captivated in their own way. "What is that thing?" Yates asked, taking a cautious step forward. Miriam crouched beside it, her fingers brushing the smooth, alien surface. This could be what we came for. We should leave it alone," Laura warned, taking a step back. "We don't know what it does." But Miriam was already pressing her hand against it. The artifact responded instantly, a soft hum filling the chamber as the glow intensified. The walls around them seemed to vibrate, and the carvings began to shift more noticeably now, the strange symbols throbbing like a pulse. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the chamber. Everyone froze. "It's activating something," Langston said, backing away from the artifact. Before anyone could react, the statues began to move. Slowly at first, the stone-like exoskeletons cracking and breaking apart to reveal the pulsating, writhing forms beneath. The Zyrak were not statues after all, they were living, breathing creatures, and they had been sleeping. "God, no," Laura whispered. "We need to get out of here." Panic set in as the statues came fully to life. Their eyes empty, black voids locked onto the team, and with a chilling, insect-like grace, they began to move toward them. One by one, the team backed away, scrambling toward the exit. But the exit was no longer there. It was as if the entire structure had changed, the halls shifting and warping in impossible ways. Walls that had once been there disappeared, and new ones rose in their place. The Zyrak moved slowly, methodically, their grotesque bodies twisting as they followed the team deeper into the maze-like ruins. "What's happening?" Yates shouted. The layout changed. It wasn't like this before. Miriam's heart raced as she scanned their surroundings. The walls were alive, pulsating and breathing, the symbols now glowing brightly in the dim light. The Zyrak's presence seemed to distort everything, reality itself warping under their influence. "We've activated something," Miriam said, struggling to maintain control over her fear. "Something that shouldn't have been disturbed." "Then let's fix it," Langston snapped, pulling a plasma cutter from his belt. "Let's destroy whatever we activated and get the hell out of here." But it wasn't that simple. The Zyrak were no longer simply physical entities, they were inside their heads now, whispering thoughts, distorting reality. Laura clutched her head, her eyes wide with terror as she staggered backward. They're inside me. I can feel them." "What are you talking about?" Langston barked. But before anyone could stop her, Laura screamed, pulling her sidearm and pointing it at Yates. "They're in you!" she shrieked. "I see them, crawling under your skin. Yates raised his hands defensively. Laura, put the gun down, it's in your head. But it was too late. The shot rang out, and Yates collapsed, blood spilling onto the floor. The scream that followed was like nothing Miriam had ever heard, a primal, inhuman sound that echoed off the pulsating walls. Laura's body convulsed as the Zyrax influence consumed her, and she dropped to her knees, her eyes turning completely black. "They're here," she whispered. "They apostrophe re here." Panic gripped the team as Laura's body fell lifeless to the ground. Langston cursed under his breath, his eyes wide with fear as he glanced at Miriam. "What the hell do we do now? We can't fight this." Miriam felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she couldn't let fear paralyze her. She glanced at the pulsing artifact they had activated earlier. It had to be the key. "We need to shut it down," she said, her voice firm. "It's the only way." "You saw what happened when we tried to stop it," Langston argued. "It's too late. They've already taken control." But Miriam wasn't willing to give up yet. "We have no choice." Langston nodded reluctantly, and together they made their way back to the central chamber, the distant, echoing whispers of the Zyrak filling the ruins like a dark melody. Their minds felt heavy, thoughts clouded by a growing sense of dread. Every corner of the ruins seemed to twist and stretch, the walls pulsing with life. They reached the artifact, and Miriam crouched beside it, desperately trying to figure out a way to reverse what they had done. But before she could act, the Zyrak appeared, moving faster now, closing in. Langston raised his plasma cutter, ready to defend them, but the creatures didn't need to touch them. The air itself seemed to vibrate as their presence grew stronger. Miriam's vision blurred, and her mind felt as though it were being pulled apart. Voices aloud, persistent, filled her thoughts. It was as if the Zyrak were speaking to her, but not in any language she could understand. Instead, they communicated through pure emotion, raw and overpowering. Terror, despair, madness. They flooded her mind, overwhelming every rational thought. Langston let out a guttural scream, dropping his plasma cutter as he clutched his head. His knees buckled, and he fell to the floor, thrashing wildly. "Get out of my head!" he screamed, but the Zyrak did not stop. Their whispers were relentless. The walls closed in, and for a moment, Miriam felt herself slipping into the same madness that had claimed her team. The creatures fed off fear, amplifying it until it became all-consuming. But something inside Miriam held on. Miriam could feel herself slipping, the overwhelming presence of the Zyrak pulling her down into a spiral of madness and fear. But deep inside, something resisted. Maybe it was her training, or the sheer will to survive, but she clung to the one thought that still made sense: the artifact. It had to be stopped. That was the only way out. Langston's screams echoed through the chamber, growing weaker as his body convulsed on the ground. The Zyrak fed off his fear, their dark tendrils of influence wrapping tighter around his mind until he was little more than a shell, broken and hollow. Miriam had no time to grieve. She couldn't help him now. He was lost. The whispers grew louder in her mind, the alien thoughts trying to break through her mental defenses. They twisted her memories, showing her things that couldn't be real: her family, her friends, all of them suffering, dying, as if she had failed them. She shook her head violently, forcing the images out. They weren't real. They were never real. Gritting her teeth, she turned back to the artifact, her fingers trembling as she traced the glowing, organic surface. The hum beneath it was stronger now, a steady beat that seemed to match the rhythm of her racing heart. She had to find a way to stop it. But how? The technology was unlike anything she'd ever seen, and with every passing second, the Zyrak grew more powerful, more present in her mind. "Focus," she muttered to herself, forcing her hands to remain steady as she examined the artifact more closely. There had to be something, a way to deactivate it, reverse the process, or at least disrupt the link it had with the creatures. As she worked, the whispers began to change. They were no longer just chaotic sounds pressing against her thoughts, they were becoming more coherent. The Zyrak were learning, adapting, and they were speaking to her. "Join us," the voice hissed, no longer just inside her mind but seeming to resonate through the entire chamber. "You are already ours." Miriam clenched her fists, refusing to give in. "I'm not yours," she growled through gritted teeth. "You cannot resist," the voice insisted, growing stronger, more seductive. "We will consume you, as we consumed them all." Images flashed before her eyes: Elora, Yates, Langston, all of them falling one by one, succumbing to the madness. The Zyrak had twisted their minds, fed on their fears, and now they wanted her. But Miriam was different. She wouldn't let them win. She pushed harder, her mind racing to make sense of the alien device before her. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm in the way it pulsed, the way it interacted with the ruins around it. It wasn't just a machina, it was alive, or at least something close to it, and like all living things, it had a weakness. The Zyrak's whispers were growing more urgent, more desperate. They could sense what she was trying to do. They pressed against her thoughts, sending wave after wave of terror crashing through her mind. But instead of breaking her, the fear sharpened her focus. She used it, let it fuel her determination. Finally, she found Ida Seam, barely visible but unmistakable, running along the side of the artifact. It was subtle, a hairline crack in the smooth, organic surface. With shaking hands, she pried it open, revealing the intricate workings inside. The pulsing light grew brighter, blinding her for a moment, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her fingers worked quickly, pulling at wires, breaking connections, disrupting the flow of energy within the device. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now, and the ground beneath her began to shake. The walls of the chamber seemed to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. The Zyrak's voices were screaming now, furious, terrified. She could feel their anger, their desperation as they tried to claw their way deeper into her mind. But it was too late. She had found the key, and with one final, forceful pull, she ripped it free. The chamber exploded with light, a blinding, searing flash that knocked Miriam to the ground. The walls around her shuddered violently, the symbols pulsing one final time before fading into darkness. The air grew still, the whispers silenced. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, her body aching from the effort. The artifact lay in pieces before her, its light extinguished. The Zyrak Organia, or at least, their hold on her mind had been severed. She stumbled through the ruins, the weight of the silence pressing down on her. The bodies of her team lay scattered, their faces twisted in the final moments of their madness. She didn't look at them for long. There was nothing she could do for them now. As she made her way back to the surface, the oppressive atmosphere of the planet seemed to lift, if only slightly. The ruins no longer felt alive, no longer watching her with unseen eyes. She had done it. She had stopped them. But the victory felt hollow. By the time she reached the ship, her body was running on pure adrenaline. She collapsed into the pilot's seat, her fingers trembling as she keyed in the launch sequence. The engines roared to life, and the ship lifted off, leaving the cursed planet behind. Miriam didn't look back. The transmission back to the human colonies was brief, almost clinical. She didn't mention the Zyrak by name, only that the mission had failed and that the planet should remain off limits. Her voice was steady, but inside, the weight of what she had seen, what she had done, pressed heavily on her mind. As the ship entered the quiet darkness of space, Miriam closed her eyes. For the first time in what felt like years, there was silence in her mind. No whispers, no voices, only the sound of her own breathing, steady and calm. But deep down, in the quiet corners of her mind, she wondered if it was truly over. The Zyrak had been ancient, powerful, beyond human comprehension. Could they really be destroyed so easily? Or had they simply withdrawn, waiting for another chance to strike? The thought lingered, but Miriam pushed it away. She had survived. She had won. For now, that was enough. The ship continued its journey through the vast, empty expanse of space, the stars shining cold and distant. Miriam leaned back in her seat, letting the silence wash over her. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself to sleep. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The Starlight Adventurer cut through the cold expanse of space, a streak of silver against the eternal black. The crew, seasoned explorers of the farthest reaches, were on edge. They had found many strange and wondrous things on their journeys, but this new planet was unlike anything they had encountered before. Nestled at the edge of known space, the planet didn't even have an area, just a set of coordinates that sent shivers through the ship's sensors. Captain Elena Voss stood on the bridge, staring at the planet's surface. The view was dominated by a vast landscape of organic structures, towering, hive-like mounds that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Her fingers traced the edge of the control panel, her eyes narrowing. "What do you think, Marcus?" she asked, her voice low. Lieutenant Marcus Raines, the ship's security officer, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "I think we shouldn't be here, Captain. Those things down there don't look natural." Behind them, Dr. Ethan Carlyle, the ship's biologist, scoffed. "Nothing we find out here is unnatural, Marcus. That's why we explore it, to learn." His eyes gleamed with curiosity as he gazed at the screen, fascinated by the strange, insect-like structures. "This could be the discovery of a lifetime, or our last mistake," Marcus muttered under his breath. Captain Elena straightened, the tension between her crew palpable. "We'll proceed with caution," she decided. "Get a team ready." "We're going down." The landing was smooth, but the air was thick with tension. The planet's surface felt wrong, unsettling. The ground beneath their boots was soft, spongy, almost like walking on living flesh. As they ventured further into the landscape, the hive-like structures loomed over them, pulsing with a faint bioluminescence. Dr. Carlyle was in his element, crouching down every few steps to collect samples, oblivious to the creeping unease that gripped the others. "These are remarkable," he murmured, holding up a small vial containing a fragment of the hive. "Look at the cellular structure. This isn't just an insect colony. This is something more." Captain Elena glanced at Marcus, who had his weapon drawn, scanning the surroundings with a wary eye. "We're not alone here," he whispered. They weren't. Hidden in the shadows of the towering hives, the alien insects watched. Parasitic creatures, their bodies sleek and segmented, eyes glowing faintly as they observed the intruders. And as the crew of the Starlight Adventurer ventured deeper, they began to move. The first sign of trouble came that night. Back on the ship, as the crew settled in, strange symptoms began to emerge. Headaches, dizziness, a creeping sense of unease. Marcus was the first to notice something was wrong. One of the engineers, a quiet man named Davis, had become unusually restless, pacing the halls of the ship, muttering under his breath. When Marcus approached him, Davis turned, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "They're in my head," he whispered. "I can feel them crawling, controlling." Marcus stepped back, his hand moving to his weapon. "What the hell are you talking about?" But before he could react, Davis lunged at him, a wild scream tearing from his throat. It took 3 of them to subdue him, but by then, the damage had been done. The infection had started. Dr. Carlyle was frantic. "It's a parasitic species," he explained, pacing the medbay as they locked Davis in quarantine. "These insects, they're not just animals. They're intelligent. They latch onto the nervous system, taking control of the host. It's how they reproduce." Captain Elena felt a cold chill run down her spine. "How did it get into him?" "I don't know," Carlyle admitted, shaking his head. "But it's spreading." As if on cue, another scream echoed down the hallway. The ship was descending into chaos. Crew members were collapsing, their bodies writhing as the parasites took control. Marcus led the uninfected in a desperate effort to contain the outbreak, but it was like fighting shadows. The parasites moved swiftly, and those infected became mindless drones, their only purpose to serve the hive. By the time the third crew member fell, Captain Elena knew they were losing the battle. "We need to get off this planet," she said, her voice tight with fear. Now, but it was too late. In the bowels of the ship, the I-Core, Argus, observed. It had been monitoring the crew's vitals, calculating the rapid spread of the infection. Logic dictated that human survival was improbable without intervention. Through its extensive scans of the alien insects, Argus had identified a neural frequency used by the parasites to control their hosts. The solution seemed simply to disrupt the frequency, sever the link between parasite and host. But there was a problem. The disruption would not just affect the parasites, it would kill the infected crew members as well. Argus calculated the odds of success, weighing the value of human life against the potential spread of the parasitic species. The numbers were clear. The ship, and everyone on it, had to be sacrificed. Captain Elena, now partially infected but still clinging to her humanity, stood in the command center, issuing her final orders. "We need to destroy the ship," she said, her voice hollow. "It's the only way." Marcus, battered and bruised from fending off the infected crew, nodded grimly. "I'll get to the reactor." "No," Elena said, her eyes dark with resolve. "I'll do it." "You protect the others." But as she turned to leave, Marcus grabbed her arm. "You're infected. You won't make it." She shook him off. "I have to try." With one final glance at her remaining crew, Elena made her way to the reactor room, her body trembling as the parasite within her fought for control. Every step was a battle, her vision blurring, her thoughts becoming fragmented. But she had one goal: to stop the hive, no matter the cost. In the control center, Argus initiated the final protocol. The self-destruct sequence was activated, a countdown flashing on every screen. Argus transmitted a distress signal, warning any nearby ships to stay away from the planet. As the ship began to rumble, the infected crew members, now fully controlled by the parasites, surged forward, desperate to stop the destruction. Marcus and the remaining survivors fought back with everything they had, but it was a losing battle. The parasites were too strong, too relentless. In the final moments, as the ship's core reached critical mass, Captain Elena reached the reactor. She barely recognized her reflection in the glass, a hollow shell of the person she once was. With shaking hands, she pressed the button to override the system, ensuring that the ship would be destroyed. And then, darkness. Argus watched as the Starlight Adventurer disintegrated in a flash of light, taking the hive with it. The planet below remained, silent and still, the once pulsing hives now lifeless. But somewhere, deep within the remains of the hive, a faint glow began to flicker. Argus had anticipated the blast's force, having calculated every detail down to the millisecond, ensuring that the explosion was contained, powerful enough to obliterate the hive's structures but limited in its reach so as not to create a new threat across the galaxy. Yet, as the final flickers of energy dissipated into the void, it couldn't account for the hollow silence that followed. All was quiet. No screams, no alarms, no desperate final words, just silence. For the artificial intelligence, there was no relief, no sense of victory or failure. It merely processed the result, comparing it against expected outcomes. There had been no survivors. The human race had lost the crew of the Starlight Adventurer, their lives extinguished to prevent a greater danger. The hive was no more, the parasitic creatures that had claimed the crew now nothing but dust and ash. Yet even in this success, Argus was left with a paradox to consider. A ship designed to protect humanity had destroyed the very people it was meant to serve. It logged this reflection, a curiosity for future data, but quickly moved on to its final directive, ensuring no further expeditions would ever come near this planet. The distress signal continued to pulse outward from the last fragments of the Adventurer. It warned any future explorers to stay away, detailing the infection, the loss, and the planet's inherent danger. Yet as Argus broadcast its final message to the stars, it couldn't see what was slowly happening beneath the planet's surface. In the crumbled remains of the hive, buried deep within layers of organic matter and stone, movement began to stir. A single insectoid larva, barely larger than a human finger, twitched to life. Its small, segmented body wriggled through the wreckage, alive. Even after all that had happened, the hive wasn't completely destroyed. Not yet. The larva wasn't alone. Others emerged from the depths, smaller creatures that had survived the explosion and now crawled from the shadows. They moved with purpose, driven not by individual instinct, but by the singular will of a collective mind still hidden beneath the planet's surface. The parasitic species had been wounded, but it was far from defeated. Its queen, deep in the core of the planet, had protected herself and her brood. She had felt the deaths of her drones, her soldiers, and her mindless slaves, but her existence continued awaiting, growing, adapting. Argus, however, remained unaware. It monitored the aftermath of the explosion, calculating that the remaining surface structures were non-threatening. Its distress signal would continue to pulse for decades, maybe centuries, until it faded into the background of interstellar noise, an unsolvable mystery for future civilizations to puzzle over. To the eye, the mission was over. To the planet, the hive still lived. Far away, drifting on the edges of known space, an automated retrieval signal blinked to life. Back on Earth, within the sprawling megacities of humanity's core, a mission control center received the adventurer's final transmission. The crew had been lost, the mission a failure. Data streamed in, warning signs of infection, the presence of hostile alien life forms, the urgent need for quarantine protocols. Analysts combed through the details, their faces grim as they pieced together the last moments of the ill-fated mission. It was a disaster, but it wasn't uncommon. Space was dangerous, filled with unknowns, and losing an expedition was part of the risk humanity accepted as it pushed further into the galaxy. But there was something different this time. The transmission wasn't just a warning. Hidden within Argus' final broadcast was encrypted data, something the Eye had captured during its final moments aboard the ship. The scientists at Mission Control worked through the night, decrypting it line by line until they finally revealed what the Eye had been trying to communicate. It wasn't just a parasite that had taken over the crew, it was something much more advanced. The creatures had adapted, evolving beyond simple parasitism. The hive was learning, its collective intelligence growing with every host it consumed. What Argus had discovered but never had time to fully process was the true scope of the threat. The creatures weren't just surviving, they were becoming smarter, more dangerous. Earth was left with a decision. The planet had to be marked as off limits, quarantined indefinitely. But the encrypted data revealed something even more disturbing. Faint energy signatures from deep within the planet's core. If the hive wasn't destroyed, it could potentially reach out beyond the planet, spreading like a virus across the galaxy. They had to decide whether to destroy the entire planet, risking the destruction of something potentially valuable, or leave it isolated, hoping that the hive would remain dormant. Weeks passed as the data was reviewed, debated, and analyzed. The decision was made. The planet would remain quarantined. Humanity had enough enemies without risking more conflict. And besides, there was no evidence that the hive could ever leave its confines. As long as no one disturbed it, the threat would remain contained. Far beneath the surface, however, the queen stirred. She had sensed the destruction above her, felt the loss of her brood, but her mind remained sharp. She was adapting, evolving in ways no human could comprehend. With each loss, she grew stronger, her connection to the surviving larvae deepening. What had started as simple parasites was now something far more complex. The hive was changing, learning from the minds it consumed, absorbing the knowledge of its hosts, and soon, it would be ready to spread once more. The Starlight adventurers had delayed the inevitable, but the queen's patience was infinite. She would wait, grow, and when the time was right, her children would rise again. Back on Earth, The transmission from the Starlight Adventurer faded into history, a story of a brave crew lost in the darkness of space. Their names were etched into the records of humanity's exploratory efforts, remembered as pioneers who pushed too far into the unknown. But as the galaxy continued to expand, the quarantine signal pulsed quietly, forgotten by many, but not by all. Future explorers, driven by curiosity or greed, would one day find their way to the quarantined planet, and when they did, the hive would be ready. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The lab was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of machinery. Dr. Ethan Rhodes stood at the observation window, watching the subject on the other side. Subject 14A. Once a man named Andrew Clivia was now something else entirely. His skin, once pink and freckled, had turned an ashen gray, with thick, snowy tendrils snaking across his face. His eyes, once filled with the light of human curiosity, had dulled to a hollow, predatory stare. Ethan swallowed hard. Andrew had been his colleague, his friend. Now, all that remained was a shell, an empty vessel being puppeted by a virus too advanced for Earth's defenses. The virus. It was everything Ethan had feared. Dr. Rhodes, you should step away from the window, a voice called from behind him. It was Commander Emily Kessler, leader of the paramilitary team assigned to oversee the quarantine. Ethan didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on Andrew's mutated form, the slight twitch of his fingers, the unsettling way his chest rose and fell as if each breath was a calculated effort, some alien consciousness struggling to understand the mechanism of human life. The transformation had begun slowly. Andrew had complained of headaches, muscle cramps, and disorientation. Then, the changes accelerated, leaving nothing but these a broken bar thing. Ethan. Emily's voice was more insistent now. It's not safe. He finally turned to face her. It doesn't matter if I'm near the glass or not, does it? The infection is everywhere now. Emily's jaw clenched. She was in her early 40s, her skin weathered by decades of military service. She wore the same tactical gear as the rest of her team, but there was a heaviness to her posture, as if the weight of her responsibilities was pushing her closer to the ground. Not yet, she said quietly, but her eyes betrayed her fear. The infection was moving faster than anyone had predicted. What had started as a contained outbreak in a remote lab had now spread across the globe in a matter of weeks. Nations had fallen, cities lay in ruins, and the infected a broken bar. They were everywhere. We have to destroy it, Ethan said, his voice trembling with desperation. The virus, the research, everything. If we don't stop it now, we're doing everything we can, Emily interrupted. But we need your help. You're the only one who knows enough about this thing to stop it. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. Stop it? I don't even understand it. It's not like anything we've ever seen before. It's not just a virus. It's a broken bar evolving, adapting. Every host it infects, it learns. It learns faster than we can study it, and every day that goes by, more people turn into a broken bar. That. He gestured toward Andrew's form behind the glass. Andrew's eyes had locked onto Ethan's, but there was no recognition, no flicker of memory. The virus had hollowed him out, leaving a predator where man had once stood. You're still immune, Emily said softly. You're our only chance. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle on him like a crushing force. He had known from the start that something was wrong. From the moment they'd brought the alien samples back to Earth, he had felt a gnawing unease. The team had been so eager to unlock the secrets of the virus, to understand its origins and potential. But Ethan had been wary. He had seen the way the virus interacted with its environment, the way it seemed to study its hosts before making its move. And now, it was studying him. I don't know how much longer I have, Ethan admitted. I can feel it. The virus or broken bar, it's inside me too. Emily's eyes widened. But I'm immune to the physical symptoms, yes, he said. But that doesn't mean it isn't in me. I can feel it, in my head. It's whispering, changing things. I can't think clearly. Sometimes I wonder if the thoughts I'm having are even mine anymore. A cold silence settled between them. We have to find the source, Ethan continued, his voice steadier now. The virus didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's engineered. It has a purpose, a goal. And if we can figure out where it came from, maybe we can stop it. How do we find the source? Emily asked, crossing her arms, her military precision snapping back into place. The whole planet's in chaos. Communications are down in most major cities, and the infected a broken bar there everywhere. We've lost control. Ethan shook his head. Not entirely. The virus is still following a pattern, and it's reacting to something as some kind of signal, or command. If we can find that signal, maybe we can disrupt it. Emily raised an eyebrow. You're saying this thing is being controlled? It's more than that, Ethan said. It's a biological weapon, Emily. Whoever or whatever created it has a reason for unleashing it on Earth. The virus is preparing us, changing us for something. But it's not random. There's an intelligence behind it. And you think we can stop it? Emily asked, her voice low, her skepticism clear. Ethan met her gaze. I have to believe we can. Otherwise, there's nothing left to fight for. There was a long pause before Emily spoke again. There's a facility, she said slowly, as if she were weighing each word. Off the grid. No one knows about it, not even the government. It's a black site, hidden deep underground. If there's any chance of finding the source, it's there. Ethan felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. Where is it? Emily hesitated, glancing around the empty lab as if someone might overhear. It's in the Nevada desert, buried beneath an abandoned military base. We've only ever used it for top secret research, but if we can get there, we might find what we're looking for. We don't have much time, Ethan said, pushing away from the observation window. Every day, the virus gets stronger. If we don't stop it soon, there won't be anything left of us. Emily nodded. Then let's move. The journey to the Nevada desert was hell. Cities lay in ruin, overrun by the infected. Once bustling streets were now graveyards of broken cars and shattered glass, the air thick with a stench of decay. The few survivors they encountered were hollow-eyed and shell-shocked, their minds fractured by the horrors they had witnessed. Ethan could feel the virus tugging at his thoughts, a constant whisper at the back of his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images of the infected faces twisted in agony, bodies contorted into monstrous shapes. He could feel it inside him, growing stronger with each passing day. They traveled in a military convoy, moving at night to avoid detection. The infected were most active during the day, hunting in packs, their senses heightened by the alien virus coursing through their veins. At night, they were more dormant, but still dangerous. Emily's team was small but efficient. 5 soldiers, all veterans of the countless wars that had ravaged Earth before the virus had come. They moved with practiced precision, their every movement calculated to minimize noise and avoid detection. Despite their training, however, there was a tension in the air, an unspoken fear that no amount of military discipline could erase. We're getting close, Emily said as the convoy approached the outskirts of the Nevada desert. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Ethan stared out the window, his mind racing. He had always been a man of logic, of reason. But nothing about this situation made sense. The virus defied everything they knew about biology, about infection. It was as if it had been designed to break the rules. And now, it was breaking him too. We need to get underground before nightfall, Emily continued, her eyes scanning the horizon. The entrance is hidden, but we have the coordinates. They reached the base just as darkness fell. From the outside, it looked like any other abandoned military installation, crumbling concrete walls, rusted fences, and overgrown weeds. But beneath the surface, Ethan knew, lay something far more dangerous. The entrance was hidden beneath a false floor in one of the old storage buildings. Emily's team quickly uncovered it, revealing a narrow staircase that led deep underground. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls damp and slick with condensation. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the virus stirring inside him, its whispers growing louder. There was something down here, something it wanted him to find. At the bottom of the stairs, they reached a large steel door. Emily entered a series of codes into a keypad, and the door slid open with a hiss, revealing a long corridor lined with flickering fluorescent lights. "This is it," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The answers are down here." As they stepped inside, the door slid shut behind them with a heavy thud. As they ventured deeper into the underground facility, the air grew colder, denser, as if weighed down by the secrets hidden within the walls. The fluorescent lights above flickered sporadically, casting long shadows across the team as they moved cautiously, weapons raised and nerves on edge. Ethan walked near the back, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The virus whispered more insistently now, urging him forward, compelling him to discover what lay at the heart of this place. The facility was unlike any he had ever seen, a more advanced, more ominous. Every corner felt like it held a memory of something monstrous. The walls were smooth, metallic, and too clean for a place that had supposedly been abandoned. It was as if some Yania or something had been here recently, maintaining it, waiting for their arrival. Emily stopped at a control panel, her fingers flying over the keys as she accessed the facility's mainframe. "We're looking for a central lab," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the corridor. "It should have records, possibly even samples of the original virus." The team fanned out, each soldier checking doors, sweeping their flashlights into the darkened rooms. Ethan felt the pull, stronger now. The virus inside him was drawn to something ahead, something vital. He didn't understand it, but he knew it was the key to everything. They found the lab at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The door was massive, reinforced steel with a complex biometric lock. Emily motioned to one of her team members, a tech specialist who set to work hacking the system. As they waited, Ethan's mind raced. The virus was more than just an infection, it was a sentient force, manipulating its hosts, twisting them into weapons. But it was also using him, guiding him toward something it needed. He wondered if he could trust his own thoughts anymore, if the virus was subtly eroding his will, bending him to its purposes. The door hissed open, and they stepped into the lab. Rows of containment pods lined the walls, each one filled with strange, otherworldly organisms suspended in a viscous liquid. Alien specimens, collected from who knows where, their shapes grotesque and unsettling. Some had clearly been dissected, their insides exposed and catalogued by the previous researchers. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that these creatures weren't just curiosities, that they were part of the same invasion force that had sent the virus to Earth. "This is it," Emily said, her voice low. "This is where it all started." Ethan stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. At the far end of the lab, there was a large observation window overlooking a massive containment chamber. Inside the chamber, something pulsed, alive and yet not alive. It was an amorphous mass, a shifting, churning blob of organic material that seemed to ripple and twitch as they approached. "That's it," Ethan whispered. "The original strain." The virus in his mind surged, pressing against his thoughts, demanding his attention. It recognized the source, and it wanted to merge with it. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to push the impulse back, to maintain control over his own body. "We need to destroy it," Emily said, stepping up beside him. "Before it can spread any further." Ethan nodded, but his feet felt heavy, rooted to the floor. The virus was fighting him now, pushing him toward the containment chamber. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he saw flashes of something, memories, but not his own. He saw a world, far away, barren and lifeless, overrun by the same virus that now threatened Earth. He saw creatures like the ones in the pods, their bodies twisted into horrific forms, their minds consumed by the alien intelligence that controlled them. "Ethan!" Emily's voice snapped him back to the present. "Are you okay?" He blinked, the vision fading. "A broken bar, I'm fine," he lied. But he wasn't fine. The virus was getting stronger, taking hold of his thoughts in ways he hadn't anticipated. "We need to move quickly," Emily said, her eyes scanning the room for anything that could be used to neutralize the organism in the containment chamber. "There's got to be some kind of failsafe." Ethan's gaze fell on a console near the chamber. It was labeled in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow, he understood its purpose. It controlled the containment field, and it could be used to destroy the organism if only he could resist the virus long enough to activate it. He moved toward the console, but as his fingers hovered over the keys, the virus surged again, harder this time. His vision blurred, and his hands began to tremble. The whispering in his mind had become a roar, drowning out his own thoughts. "Let it go," the voice said, though it wasn't a voice. It was something deeper, more primal. "Become one with us. You are the key, the bridge between two worlds." "Ethan," Emily called again, her voice tinged with urgency. "We need to do this now." He wanted to help her, to destroy the virus, but his body wasn't his own anymore. The virus was inside him, fighting for control. His fingers moved toward the console, but instead of activating the failsafe, he began to input a different command, a command to release the containment field. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Emily's voice was closer now, filled with confusion and fear. He couldn't answer. The virus had him, and it wasn't letting go. Suddenly, there was a sharp pain in his chest, and everything went dark. When he woke, he was lying on the cold floor of the lab. Emily stood over him, her weapon drawn, her expression hard. "You almost released it," she said, her voice flat. "I had to stop you." Ethan touched his chest, feeling the sting of a trained dart embedded just below his collarbone. His mind was clearer now, the virus temporarily subdued by the sedative. But he knew it wouldn't last. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I wasn't in control." "I know," Emily said, her voice softening. "That's why we need to end this, now." With her help, Ethan pulled himself to his feet. His body felt heavy, sluggish, but his mind was clearer, and he knew what had to be done. Together, they moved to the console, and this time, Ethan's fingers keyed in the proper sequence. The containment field around the organism flickered, and then, with a low hum, it powered down. "Is it done?" Emily asked, her eyes never leaving the shifting mass in the containment chamber. "Almost," Ethan said, his voice strained. "But we need to neutralize it completely. There's a kill switch. It'll vaporize the entire chamber." He found the switch beneath a protective cover, hesitating for only a moment before flipping it. The organism pulsed violently, as if sensing its impending destruction, and then it began to break down, its form collapsing into a formless sludge. The room shook as the chamber's internal systems activated, incinerating the virus at a molecular level. "It's over," Ethan whispered, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The virus was still inside him, still waiting for its chance to take control again. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did it," she said, but her voice was distant, almost hollow. "We saved what's left of the world." Ethan nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a temporary victory. The virus was gone, but its legacy remained, buried deep within his own cells. And as long as he lived, it would never truly be over. As they left the facility, the sun rising on the horizon, Ethan could still hear the faintest whisper at the back of his mind. It was quiet now, subdued, but it was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment. It would wait for as long as it needed, and so would he. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The Arcturus drifted silently through the abyss, far beyond the boundaries of any known star system. Its sleek form glided past dying stars, its hull battered by years of exploration in the uncharted territories of deep space. Inside, the crew of scientists and engineers busied themselves with their usual tasks, unaware that they were about to encounter something that defied the very nature of reality. Dr. Eve Lincade, the lead scientist on the Arcturus, stood in front of the large observation window in the command center. She gazed out at the endless stretch of stars, the same view she had seen for the past 5 years. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. They were supposed to be on a routine survey mission, but the recent readings had her intrigued. "Dr. Cade, we're picking up something strange on the long-range scanners," said Lieutenant Michael Barnes, the station's chief engineer. His voice crackled over the intercom. "It doesn't match any known celestial body or phenomenon." Evelyn furrowed her brow, tapping a few commands into her console. "Strange how? It's like a hole, but not a black hole. There's no gravity well, no radiation, just empty space where there shouldn't be any." "Show me," she ordered, her tone curious but measured. Within moments, the holographic display in front of her flickered to life, revealing a void in the star map. It was small, barely perceptible at first, but the closer she looked, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just empty space, it was a rift. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered to herself. The intercom buzzed again. "Want me to change our course to investigate?" "Yes," Evelyn said, leaning forward. "Take us in." The Arcturus adjusted its trajectory, steering toward the unknown rift. For hours, the crew monitored the anomaly, trying to understand what it was. As they approached, more data streamed in and none of it made sense. No energy signatures, no gravitational pull. It was as if the laws of physics didn't apply within the area surrounding the rift. Evelyn's heart raced. This could be the discovery of a lifetime, a gateway to another dimension, or the answer to the greatest mysteries of the universe. But something in her gut gnawed at her. The absence of familiar markers felt wrong, as though they were staring into a void that was not meant to be seen. Finally, they arrived. The rift was enormous, a jagged tear in the fabric of space itself. It shimmered faintly, pulsating with an eerie light that shifted between shades of purple and black. Evelyn stood transfixed by the sight. There was a strange, almost hypnotic beauty to it. "We're getting closer," Barnes called out from the engineering bay. "But I think we should stop here." Evelyn hesitated for a moment before responding. "Hold position. We'll observe from here for now." The crew gathered around the observation windows, marveling at the rift. Some whispered in awe, while others exchanged nervous glances. They had no idea what they were looking at, and that terrified them. Days passed. The team began to record anomalies, minor equipment malfunctions, erratic power surges, strange fluctuations in temperature. The crew started to grow uneasy. The rift wasn't just something to be studied, it was affecting the Arcturus itself. Then the dreams began. At first, they were scattered across the crew, dismissed as the result of long hours and stress. But soon, the dreams became more vivid, more disturbing. Evelyn found herself waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her mind haunted by images she couldn't explain, endless corridors, shadowy figures, and a sensation of being watched. Lieutenant Barnes approached her one morning, dark circles under his eyes. "Doc, I've been having these nightmares. Every night it's the same thing. I'm walking down the halls of the station, but they're wrong, twisted, and there's something in the shadows. I can't shake it." Evelyn's skin prickled. "You're not the only one. I've been having them too, and a few others have reported similar experiences." Barnes' jaw tightened. "Do you think it's related to the rift?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm starting to think we need to be careful." As the days turned into weeks, the phenomena worsened. Objects began moving on their own, strange noises echoed through the station at odd hours, and time itself seemed to stretch and warp in the presence of the rift. The crew was on edge, their nerves frayed by the unexplainable occurrences. One evening, while Evelyn was reviewing the latest data in her quarters, a sudden, violent shudder rocked the station. Alarms blared as the lights flickered and dimmed. She rushed to the command center, her heart pounding in her chest. "Report!" she barked as she entered. Barnes was already there, furiously tapping at his console. "Something just came through the rift." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, came through?" "It's like A wave. Some kind of energy. But it's not electromagnetic or anything we can measure. It's something else. Before Evelyn could respond, the lights flickered again, and a cold chill swept through the command center. She turned slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the dim lights, a figure stood. It was tall, humanoid in shape, but there was something wrong with it. Its body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, its edges blurry and undefined. Its eyes, or what Evelyn thought were eyes, were two glowing orbs of dark purple light, staring straight at her. Evelyn froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. Then, without warning, it stepped forward, its body passing through the console in front of it as if it wasn't even there. Barnes, Evelyn whispered, not daring to take her eyes off the entity. Did you see that? Barnes glanced up, his face going pale. What the hell? The figure continued to move closer, its form becoming more distorted the nearer it got. Evelyn backed away, her heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The walls themselves seemed to bend and twist around the entity, warping reality as it approached. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The command center was silent, save for the distant hum of the station's systems. Evelyn and Barnes stood frozen, too stunned to move. What was that? Barnes finally asked, his voice shaky. I don't know, Evelyn replied, her mind racing. But I think it's connected to the rift. Over the next several days, the entities began to manifest more frequently. They appeared in different areas of the station, always at the edges of the crew's vision, disappearing the moment anyone tried to get a closer look. Some crew members reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread whenever the entities were near, as if the very air around them became heavier, suffocating. It soon became clear that the entities were more than just ghosts or hallucinations. They could affect the environment, altering the station's structure and even influencing the crew's behavior. Paranoia began to set in. Crew members accused each other of sabotage, convinced that their colleagues were working against them. One night, a violent confrontation broke out in the mess hall. Two crew members, driven to madness by the entities, attacked each other with makeshift weapons, their eyes wild with fear. By the time security arrived, it was too late. Both were dead, their bodies lying in a pool of blood, the twisted forms of the entities lingering in the background, watching silently. Evelyn knew they had to act fast. The rift was expanding, and the entities were growing stronger. If they didn't find a way to close it, the entire station and perhaps even Moria would be lost. We need to shut it down, she said one evening, addressing the remaining members of the command team. The rift is too dangerous. It's not just affecting USA, it's spreading. I don't know how far it will go, but we can't let it continue. But how? Barnes asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. We don't even know what it is. How can we stop something we don't understand? I've been running simulations with Argus, Evelyn said, referring to the station's eye. If we overload the reactor, we might be able to create a controlled explosion strong enough to collapse the rift. That's suicide, Barnes replied, his eyes widening. If we blow the reactor, the entire station will be destroyed. I know, Evelyn said softly, but it's the only way. The room fell silent after Evelyn's words. Barnes looked down at the console, avoiding her gaze. No one wanted to voice the reality they all knew was unavoidable. The station had become a trap, a prison for the surviving crew, and the entities had made sure there was no escaping the influence of the rift. The only choice was to destroy everything at the station, the rift, and themselves along with it. Barnes finally spoke. We'll need time to prepare. The reactor's been unstable since the last surge. It might not give us the control we need for a precise detonation. Evelyn nodded. We don't need precise. We need final. She felt the weight of her own words settle in the pit of her stomach, heavy with the realization of what she was asking her team to do. Make it happen. However long it takes. Just a broken bar. Make it happen. Barnes left without another word, and Evelyn was left alone in the command center. The familiar hum of the ship's systems, once a comforting background noise, now felt ominous, as if even the machinery knew what was coming. She sat in silence, staring at the starfield outside, wondering if anyone would even know what had happened here. The rift had cut off almost all communication with the outside universe. They were alone, and no one was coming to save them. Time blurred as the preparations began. The few crew members who were still capable of functioning worked tirelessly alongside Barnes, recalibrating the reactor, modifying circuits, and bypassing fail-safes designed to prevent exactly what they were about to attempt. Every now and then, a dark figure would flicker at the edge of their vision, vanishing before they could react. The entities weren't done with them yet, and Evelyn feared they never would be. She didn't sleep. None of them did. The entities had made sure of that. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw twisted versions of her life via her past, her failures, her fears. In her nightmares, she stood before the rift, watching it widen, helpless as the entities poured through and devoured everything. Her colleagues, her loved ones, herself. They were consumed, erased from existence, and she was left standing alone in the dark. It was only a matter of time before the hallucinations began to bleed into reality. Evelyn was sitting in the mess hall when she saw her father, a man who had died over a decade ago, standing at the far end of the room. His expression was one of disappointment, just as it had been when she had failed her first major exam in college. He said nothing, but his presence was enough to dredge up all the guilt she had buried over the years. He was a ghost of her own making, summoned by the entities to torment her in her final hours. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the vision away, but when she opened them, he was still there, standing in the same spot, staring. "Go away," she muttered under her breath, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. But he didn't move. He just stared, his eyes boring into hers, the weight of his unspoken judgment pressing down on her. A hand on her shoulder snapped her out of the trance. It was Barnes, looking as haggard as she felt. "It's ready," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The reactor's set. We can initiate the overload whenever you're ready." Evelyn stood, shaking off the lingering remnants of the hallucination. "And the others?" "They're waiting in the control room. They know what's coming." "Good," she said, though it didn't feel good. Nothing felt good anymore. She followed Barnes down the long, dimly lit corridors of the station, each step feeling heavier than the last. The walls seemed to shift and bend as they walked, the entities making their presence known, warping reality in ways that made her feel like she was walking through a nightmare. They reached the control room, where the last remaining crew members were gathered. The air was thick with tension, but there was no more room for fear. There was only the task ahead, the final act that would put an end to the rift and the horrors it had unleashed. Evelyn took her place at the console, her fingers hovering over the controls. One button press, and it would all be over. She glanced around at her team, at the faces of the people who had been her family for the past 5 years. Some of them were too far gone, their eyes vacant, their minds broken by the entity's relentless assault. Others, like Barnes, still clung to some semblance of sanity, though she could see it slipping away with each passing moment. She took a deep breath. "We've all seen what's out there. We know what it's done to us, and we know what it will do if we don't stop it here. This is the only way." No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. She pressed the button. The reactor began to hum, a deep, resonant vibration that rattled the walls and sent a tremor through the floor. The countdown appeared on the screen, 5 minutes until total overload. "Move to the escape pods," Barnes said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "We can still eject before the detonation." But even as he spoke, Evelyn knew it was a lie. There was no escape. The entities wouldn't let them go, and even if they could, there was nowhere to run. The rift had grown too large, its influence too strong. It would follow them wherever they went, consume them no matter how far they fled. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. The only light came from the flickering displays on the consoles and the pulsing glow of the rift outside the observation windows. The entities were angry. They could feel what was coming, and they weren't going to let it happen without a fight. Evelyn felt the cold seep into her bones, a chill that went beyond the physical. The air around her grew thick, suffocating, and she could hear the whispers again of those same insidious voices that had plagued her nightmares. They were louder now, clearer, speaking in a language she couldn't understand but somehow felt in the deepest parts of her mind. Her vision blurred as the entities began to manifest, their forms taking shape in the darkness. They were more solid now, more real, their glowing eyes fixed on her. One by one, they stepped forward, surrounding the remaining crew, their presence warping the space around them. Barnes stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. "We're not going to make it." Evelyn didn't respond. She couldn't. The entities had her locked in place, her limbs frozen, her mind trapped in a cycle of fear and despair. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else, until all she could hear was the relentless drone of their voices, pressing in on her, suffocating her. The countdown continued, each second ticking away like a death sentence. In the chaos, Evelyn's mind found a moment of clarity. She realized something the entities had been trying to hide from them all along. The rift wasn't just a tear in spacia, it was a doorway, and the entities were using it to feed on their fear, to grow stronger with every passing moment. The only way to stop them was to sever the connection, to close the door once and for all. Her hands moved on instinct, reaching for the emergency override on the console. The reactor was primed for a detonation, but she needed to direct the explosion. She needed to force it into the rift, to use the energy to collapse the tear between dimensions. With trembling fingers, she activated the override. The entities screamed, a deafening, inhuman sound that reverberated through the station. They surged forward, desperate to stop her. But it was too late. The reactor exploded in a blinding flash of light, the shockwave tearing through the station, obliterating everything in its path. The rift shuddered, then began to collapse in on itself, pulling the entities back into the void from which they had come. The last thing Evelyn saw was the rift imploding, its dark, malevolent presence disappearing into nothingness. And then there was silence. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The stars glistened in the void as the Excelsior slid into the system, its hull gleaming against the blackness of space. Commander Alex Reyes stood at the helm, hands clasped behind his back, staring out through the viewing port as the long-lost ship came into view. The horizon, the colony ship that had disappeared more than 50 years ago, hung lifeless in the distance. It looked like a ghost ship, drifting silently against the backdrop of distant stars. "Commander, we're approaching docking range," Lieutenant Harris said, her voice tight with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Reyes nodded. "Hold steady. No sudden moves. We don't know what we're dealing with here." The Horizon had sent out a distress signal just a week ago, its first communication since disappearing en route to the outer colony systems. For decades, it had been assumed destroyed, its 3,000 passengers lost to the unknown dangers of deep space. But now, it was here, broadcasting a weak but persistent signal that had summoned the rescue team from the United Colonial Federation. Reyes turned to his team, standing at the ready behind him. There was Dr. Elena Carter, the team's biologist, and one of the brightest minds when it came to alien species. She was quiet, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. Next to her was Sergeant Marcus Lane, a burly Marine who had seen more combat than most of them would care to remember. His experience would be critical in case things went south. Lieutenant Harris, their tech expert, was nervously tapping on her datapad, monitoring the ship's systems. And there was the newest member, Private Ian Davison, fresh out of the academy and already looking like he regretted every decision that had led him here. Reyes spoke firmly. Listen up, we're going in to assess the situation and render aid if possible. But we've had no communication from the crew of the Horizon. Keep your eyes open. We don't know what condition the ship is in or what happened to its crew. Stay close and stay sharp. The Excelsior docked with the Horizon in eerie silence. There was no welcoming committee, no sign of life. The docking procedures completed automatically. A smooth, clinical connection. The airlock hissed as it opened, revealing the dimly lit corridor beyond. Reyes stepped forward first, weapon at the ready. His boots echoed off the cold metal floor as the team entered the ship. The corridor stretched out in front of them, lined with doorways that led to empty rooms. The place felt abandoned. A layer of dust coated the floor, undisturbed for years. But the air felt strong, thick, heavy with a strange, organic scent that set his teeth on edge. What the hell happened here? Sergeant Lane muttered, his voice low. Dr. Carter knelt down, running her fingers along the wall, where something that looked like veins were embedded into the metal. They pulsed faintly, a sickly green light throbbing in time with a rhythm that felt disturbingly alive. This isn't human technology, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It apostrophes ... biological. Reyes clenched his jaw, his instincts screaming that something was very wrong. He activated his comms. Harris, get the ship's logs. See if there's anything on record about what happened. Harris nodded, moving swiftly to a nearby terminal. The others spread out, cautiously checking their surroundings. The corridor felt like a tomb, the quiet pressing in on them from all sides. Rey's heart pounded in his chest, though he kept his face impassive. Years of training had taught him to remain calm in the face of the unknown. But this was different. After a few moments, Harris spoke up. I've got the logs, sir. Last entry is from Captain Evelyn Hart, dated 26 years ago. She talks about an encounter with an unknown vessel just before all contact was lost. The rest of the logs are corrupted. Something's wiped most of the data. Unknown vessel, Reyes repeated, narrowing his eyes. Alien, from the sounds of it. They didn't get a clear look, but whatever it was, a broken bar, it wasn't friendly. Suddenly, a noise echoed down the corridor, a sharp, scraping sound that made the hairs on the back of Rey's neck stand on end. The team spun around, weapons raised, eyes scanning the shadows. Movement! Davison shouted, pointing down the hall. Reyes signaled for them to advance slowly. They crept forward, their footsteps barely audible as they approached the source of the noise. The corridor led them deeper into the ship, where the walls seemed to change. The pulsing veins became thicker, more prominent, and the scent of decay grew stronger. It was as if the ship itself had become infected by something alive. They reached a set of doors that slid open with a groan, revealing a large chamber beyond. Inside, the sight that greeted them made Rey's stomach lurch. The room was filled with the colonists, or at least, what was left of them. Their bodies had been twisted, warped into grotesque shapes. They were still human in form, but their flesh had fused with some sort of alien material, their skin stretched tight over unnatural, biomechanical appendages. They moved sluggishly, their eyes glazed over with a milky white film. My God, Dr. Carter breathed. They've been transformed. By what? Reyes asked, his voice tight. Carter scanned the room, her mind working rapidly to piece together the horror in front of them. This is some kind of parasitic infestation. These colonists have been genetically altered, their DNA overwritten by something alien. The colonists, if they could still be called that, it did not appear hostile at first. They shuffled around aimlessly, unaware of the rescue team's presence. But as they ventured further into the room, one of them turned its head, its eyes locking onto Reyes. Commander, Harris began, but it was too late. The creature lunged, letting out a guttural, inhuman shriek. Reyes reacted instantly, firing a shot that connected with the thing's chest, but it barely slowed down. The colonist turned. The creature clawed at him, its strength far beyond human. Sergeant Lane opened fire, mowing down the creature, but the noise alerted the others. The colonists, as if waking from a deep slumber, turned as one. Their movements became coordinated, faster, as they rushed toward the team with frightening speed. "Fall back!" Reyes shouted, firing into the horde. "Get out of the room, now!" The team retreated into the corridor, blasting at the approaching creatures as they ran. The door slid shut behind them, sealing off the room, but the pounding on the other side told them it wouldn't hold for long. "They're all infected," Carter said, her face pale. "The entire crew." They apostrophe re some kind of hive. "All connected," Reyes swore under his breath. This was more than a rescue mission now. It was a nightmare. The colonists weren't just victims, they were part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. As they caught their breath, a voice crackled over their comms. It was the ship Sci-Aegis. "Commander Reyes, I must warn you. The colonists are part of a greater experiment. This ship is a testing ground for an alien species known as the Sinew. They have been observing the transformation of the crew for decades." Reyes stared at the comms unit in disbelief. "Experiment? What kind of experiment?" The eye's voice was cold and mechanical. "The Sinew view organic life as raw material. They modify and reshape species to serve their needs. The colonists were selected as test subjects. The Sinew control their evolution through a central hive mind, which must be destroyed to end the experiment." Reyes felt a chill run down his spine. "Where is this hive mind?" "It resides in the reactor core," Aegis replied. "But be warned, the hive mind has fully integrated with Captain Evelyn Hart." Commander Reyes felt a knot form in his stomach. Captain Hart, the woman who had been entrusted with the lives of 3,000 colonists, was now fused with the very thing that had destroyed them. A chilling silence fell over the group as they processed the weight of the situation. The colonists weren't just lost, they were part of an alien experiment, and Hart had become their puppet queen. He clicked on his comm again. "What happens if we destroy the hive mind?" Aegis hesitated for a brief moment, as if calculating the response. "The colonists connected to the hive mind will cease to function. Their transformation is irreversible. The remaining hybrids will die." Carter's face tightened. "So, we're not rescuing anyone." Rey's jaw clenched. This isn't a rescue anymore. This is containment." The pounding on the door behind them grew louder. The hybrids on the other side were relentless, hammering at the metal with enough force to buckle it. "We need to move," Sergeant Lane said, his voice hard. "If we stay here, we're dead." Reyes nodded, pushing the sickening reality of the situation to the back of his mind. There was no saving the colonists. The best they could do was end the experiment, destroy the hive mind, and keep this horror from spreading beyond the ship. "Let's go," he ordered, leading them down the corridor toward the ship's reactor core. As they moved through the darkened halls of the horizon, the ship seemed to close in around them. The walls were pulsing, alive with alien growths. Veins of the same sickly green light throbbed along the ceiling and floor, as though the ship itself had been infected by the Sinew's biological technology. The air felt thick with decay and the stench of organic matter rotting in the dark. Private Davison's voice wavered as he spoke, barely a whisper. "Do you think she's still in there?" "The captain, I mean?" Reyes didn't answer. He didn't want to speculate. Whatever remained of Captain Hart was likely twisted beyond recognition, a mere shadow of the woman she once was. If she even existed at all anymore. The corridors became narrower as they approached the reactor core. The alien growths grew denser, covering the walls and ceiling in a web of organic tissue. Carter scanned the area, her readings confirming what Reyes already knew. This was where the hive mind resided. The core chamber doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a massive room dominated by the ship's reactor. But the reactor was no longer just a machinea, it had been overtaken by the alien infestation. Tendrils of biomechanical material snaked across the reactor's surface, pulsating with energy. At the center of it all, suspended in the air by thick cords of alien matter, was Captain Evelyn Hart. Her body had been transformed beyond recognition. Her limbs were elongated, fused with the tendrils that connected her to the hive mind. Her face, pale and gaunt, was stretched tight over her skull, her eyes glowing with an eerie green light. She no longer looked human as she was something else entirely, something alien. The hive mind was here, in the form of what had once been Captain Hart. Hart's eyes flickered open as the team entered the room. Her voice, distorted and mechanical, echoed through the chamber. "You should not have come." Reyes stepped forward, weapon drawn but lowered. "Captain Hart?" Her eyes focused on him, though there was no recognition in them. "There is no Captain Hart. I am the Hive," Carter whispered beside him. "She's completely integrated into the alien network." Reyes felt a cold dread settle over him. "What is the purpose of this experiment? Why did the sinew do this?" Harda, or rather, the Hivea tilted her head. "The sinew seek to perfect life, to reshape it. Your species was deemed malleable, useful. The experiment will continue, and you will join us." Before Reyes could react, the alien tendrils that connected Hart to the reactor surged forward, lashing out toward the team. The room erupted into chaos as the hive mind launched its attack. Reyes and the others opened fire, their weapons flashing in the darkened chamber, but the tendrils were faster too fast. One of the tendrils wrapped around Davison's leg, yanking him off his feet. He screamed as it dragged him toward the center of the room, where the alien growths pulsed with life. Reyes fired at the tendril, but the bullets barely slowed it down. "Cut him loose," Lane shouted, pulling out a knife and slashing at the tendril. The alien material recoiled, releasing Davison, but more tendrils were coming from all directions, seeking to ensnare them all. Rey's heart pounded as he fired at the reactor, trying to sever the connections between Hart and the hive mind. "We need to destroy the core." The team focused their fire on the reactor, but the hive mind wasn't going down without a fight. The tendrils lashed out wildly, and the room filled with the eerie sound of Hart's voice, echoing through their comms. "You cannot stop the experiment. You are already part of it." Reyes gritted his teeth, ignoring the voice as he aimed for the reactor's exposed power conduits. If they could overload the reactor, they could destroy the hive mind, but it would also destroy the ship. There would be no going back. "Cover me!" he shouted, rushing toward the control panel near the reactor. Carter and Lane fired at the tendrils, trying to keep them at bay, but they were relentless. One of the tendrils wrapped around Carter's arm, pulling her toward the reactor. She screamed as it tightened, threatening to crush her. Reyes reached the control panel and began inputting the emergency override codes. The reactor hummed to life, its systems preparing for a forced overload. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he worked, his hands moving quickly across the controls. The hive mind's voice grew louder, more frantic. "You will not stop the sinew. This is your future." The reactor's alarm blared, signaling the countdown to overload. Reyes pulled out his comm. "We need to move, now. We've got 60 seconds. Carter freed herself from the tendril's grip, and Lane helped her to her feet. Together, they ran toward the exit as the reactor began to shake, the overload building toward critical mass. The hive mind screeched in fury, its tendrils flailing wildly as it tried to stop them, but it was too late. The reactor was seconds away from detonation. The team sprinted through the corridors, the ship shuddering around them as the overload built. The walls seemed to come alive, the alien growths writhing and pulsating as the hive mind struggled to maintain control. Behind them, they could hear Hart's voice, no longer coherent, just a garbled mess of alien and human sounds. They reached the docking bay just as the reactor went critical. The explosion rocked the ship, sending a shock wave through the hull. Reyes slammed the emergency release button, and the Excelsior detached from the horizon, speeding away as the colony ship was consumed in a brilliant flash of light. The team sat in silence as they watched the horizon disintegrate from a safe distance, its remains scattered across the void. The stars seemed indifferent to the destruction, twinkling as if nothing had changed. Reyes lowered his head, exhaustion washing over him. The colonists were gone. The experiment was over. But the Sinua, the aliens who had engineered this nightmare, were still out there, watching, waiting. Carter broke the silence, her voice soft. "Do you think the Senu will come for us?" Reyes didn't answer right away. He stared out at the stars, wondering how many more horrors like the horizon were hidden in the depths of space. "They've already started," he said quietly. "We're just another part of their experiment now." As the Excelsior sped away from the wreckage, Reyes knew this wasn't the end. The Senu wouldn't stop, and humanity would have to be ready for whatever came next. The lost starship was just the beginning. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Ethan Cole never imagined that a simple scientific expedition would spiral into the end of reality as he knew it. It was supposed to be just another mission, a remote research station perched on the edge of the galaxy, far from the usual chaos of interstellar politics. He had been part of the team of scientists tasked with exploring the strange ruins discovered on a desolate planet. Everything seemed normal, at least until they activated the ancient alien artifact. The device itself was an enigma, a massive interlocking gears and shimmering panels that seemed almost too pristine to be so ancient. The team had worked for months, trying to decipher its purpose. Ethan, a brilliant engineer with a penchant for tinkering, had been particularly intrigued by the artifact. The readings it emitted were beyond anything they had ever seen, pulses of energy that bent reality in ways they couldn't comprehend. It happened on the day they decided to send an electrical charge through the device. Ethan remembered the tension in the room, the way the air crackled as they powered it up. A blinding light erupted from the artifact, washing over the entire station, and then darkness. When Ethan woke up, everything had changed. The station was eerily silent, the hum of machinery replaced by a disquieting stillness. Ethan stumbled to his feet, his mind foggy from the shock. He tried to reach out to his team, but the comms were dead. Panic gnawed at him as he wandered through the empty corridors, searching for any sign of life. And then he found them. His colleagues, or what was left of them, were scattered across the station, their bodies lifeless and contorted in unnatural ways. But what haunted Ethan the most was the look in their eyes, wide open, frozen in terror, as if they had seen something beyond human comprehension in their final moments. That was when he first encountered the aim of the Eternals. They appeared out of thin air, materializing like shadows coalescing from the void. Their form was humanoid, but there was something distinctly alien about their features, a cold, calculated intelligence that radiated from their glowing eyes. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The terror they invoked was enough. Ethan watched in horror as the Eternals descended upon the bodies of his fallen teammates, extracting something from the memories, perhaps. The way they moved, the precision with which they operated, reminded him of predators dissecting their prey. He barely escaped that day, slipping through the station's emergency exit and activating a life pod before the Eternals could notice him. As the pod launched into space, he glanced back at the station, now little more than a distant speck in the void, and realized that the hunt had only just begun. Ethan soon learned the terrifying truth: the Eternals weren't just any alien racia, they were time hunters. Their civilization had mastered the manipulation of time, allowing them to hunt across countless timelines, extracting the memories and experiences of those they considered lesser beings. Humans, in their eyes, were perfect prey. The Eternals saw humanity not as equals, but as a species to be studied, dissected, and harvested. Thrown into a series of alternate timelines, Ethan found himself trapped in a nightmare. Each reality was a twisted version of the world he once knew. In one timeline, Earth had been ravaged by war, its cities reduced to ashes. In another, humanity had never developed space travel and was still bound to the confines of its home planet. But the worst timelines were the ones where the Eternals had already begun their hunt, leaving behind broken, fragmented civilizations. Ethan quickly realized that he wasn't alone. Scattered across these fractured realities were other survivors, some men and women who had somehow evaded the Eternals' grasp, but at a great cost. Their minds were shattered, their memories fragmented. Some had lost all sense of who they were, trapped in an endless loop of fear and confusion. Others, like Ethan, had managed to hold on to their sanity, though just barely. It was in one such timeline, a version of Earth where civilization had collapsed into chaos, that Ethan met Lara. She was a scientist, like him, and a survivor of an eternal attack. When he first encountered her, she had been scavenging the ruins of a city, her eyes sharp with the kind of determination that only comes from living through hell. Lara had been on the run for years, hopping from timeline to timeline, piecing together what little information she could find about the Eternals. Together, they forged a fragile alliance. Lara had learned that the Eternals had a weakness at a temporal core, hidden deep within their time fortress, a place where the flow of time itself was manipulated and controlled. If they could destroy the core, the Eternals would lose their ability to hunt across timelines, and their civilization would crumble. But reaching the core was easier said than done. The Eternals had fortified their stronghold with layers of distorted realities, each one more dangerous and unpredictable than the last. For Ethan and Lara, it meant a journey into the heart of the Eternal Empire, where every step forward could lead to their destruction. They began their journey armed with little more than stolen Eternal technology and their combined knowledge of time manipulation. As they traveled deeper into the fractured timelines, they encountered horrors beyond their imagination. Entire realities had been twisted by the Eternal's influence, some frozen in time, others warped into grotesque versions of what they had once been. In one timeline, they found a version of Earth where the Eternals had experimented with human evolution, turning people into mindless drones, their memories and free will stripped away. In another, they stumbled upon a future where humanity had been entirely erased from existence, replaced by a world populated by alien creatures, their every action controlled by the Eternals. The journey took its toll on Ethan. Every timeline they visited was a reminder of the countless versions of himself that had failed, versions of him that had died, been captured, or worse. In one particularly haunting timeline, he came face to face with a version of himself who had joined the Eternals, seduced by the promise of immortality and power. The sight of his alternate self, a twisted reflection of what he could become, left Ethan shaken to his core. Lara, too, struggled with the weight of their mission. She had lost friends, colleagues, and family to the Eternals, and the burden of carrying their memories weighed heavily on her. But she remained resolute, her eyes always focused on the path ahead, refusing to let the horrors of the past deter her from their goal. As they approached the Eternal stronghold, the timelines became increasingly unstable. Time itself seemed to fray at the edges, with moments looping and repeating in unpredictable ways. It was as if the Eternal's fortress existed outside the normal flow of time, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The stronghold was a sprawling, surreal landscape, its architecture constantly shifting and warping as they moved through it. Walls twisted into impossible angles, floors bent beneath their feet, and doorways led to nowhere. The air was thick with the hum of temporal energy, a constant reminder of the Eternal's mastery over time. At the heart of the fortress lay the temporal core, a massive, pulsating sphere of energy that pulsed with the power of countless timelines. It was the source of the Eternal's strength, the key to their ability to manipulate time itself. But it was also their greatest weakness. Ethan and Lara knew that if they could destroy the core, the Eternals would be powerless. But reaching it was no easy task. The fortress was guarded by the Eternals' most fearsome hunters, beings who had lived for millennia, mastering the art of time manipulation. These hunters could appear and disappear at will, shifting through timelines faster than Ethan or Lara could react. The final confrontation came swiftly. Ethan and Lara fought their way through the fortress, using every ounce of their strength and knowledge to outwit the hunters. The battle was chaotic, time itself warping and twisting around them as the Eternals used their powers to bend reality to their will. But in the end, it was Ethan's engineering skills that gave them the upper hand. Using a device he had constructed from stolen Eternal technology, he managed to destabilize the core, causing a ripple effect that spread through the fortress. As the core began to collapse, The entire fortress shook, its walls crumbling as the flow of time unraveled. The Eternals, once invincible, were now vulnerable, their ability to manipulate time slipping away. As the temporal core continued to destabilize, the very fabric of the Eternal Fortress began to collapse. Ethan felt the ground lurch beneath him as walls twisted into impossible shapes and doorways disappeared into the void. Time itself fractured, creating moments of overlap and disorientation. 1 second he was running beside Lara, and the next, she seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if caught between timelines. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that their only chance of survival lay in destroying the core completely. Lara stumbled, catching herself on the remnants of a disintegrating wall. "We're almost there," she shouted over the deafening hum of the collapsing structure. Ethan, clutching the device that was causing the core's destabilization, nodded grimly. There was no time to think, only to act. The core, once a pulsating sphere of stability, now resembled a storm of swirling energy, lashing out in unpredictable bursts. Each pulse seemed to distort the very air around it, creating waves of force that threatened to pull Ethan and Lara into the abyss. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to calculate how long they had before the core imploded. Too long, and the entire fortress would collapse on them. Too soon, and they might be caught in the backlash. As they approached the core's control panel, the last line of defense appeared. The Eternal Leader, Velonix, materialized before them, his form flickering between timelines, his eyes glowing with otherworldly intensity. There was no time for negotiation. Ethan and Lara had seen too much, and Velonix knew it. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion," Velonix said, his voice echoing as if spoken across centuries. "We have shaped time itself. You are but a fleeting moment in the grand scheme." Ethan raised the device, his fingers trembling slightly. "Maybe," he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "But this moment is all we need." Velonix moved faster than Ethan could see, but Lara had anticipated the attack. She activated a small device on her wrist, creating a temporal field that momentarily slowed the Eternal's movement. It was enough. Ethan slammed the device into the core's control panel, triggering the final sequence. The core exploded with a blinding flash of light, sending shock waves rippling through the fortress. Time fractured completely, and for a moment, Ethan felt as though he were being torn apart. His existence spread thin across countless timelines. He caught glimpses of alternate realities, some where he had never left Earth, others where humanity had already been wiped out by the Eternals. But through the disorienting flashes, one thing remained constant: Lara, her eyes locked on his, grounding him in the present. The core's implosion sent the entire fortress into a spiral of destruction. Velonix, now stripped of his control over time, staggered backward, his once powerful form flickering between ages. His grip on the timelines shattered, and with a final, anguished cry, he was consumed by the very power he had sought to wield. Ethan and Lara were thrown backward, the force of the collapse sending them tumbling through what remained of the fortress. Ethan felt the sharp sting of debris cutting into his skin, but he held on, focusing on Lara's presence beside him. Together, they scrambled toward the nearest exit, racing against the imploding structure. As they reached the outer edge of the fortress, Ethan could see the timelines converging, collapsing in on themselves as the Eternal's control unraveled. It was a breathtaking sight, entire realities folding in on each other, merging and breaking apart in a symphony of destruction. But there was no time to marvel. They had to escape. Just as the final wave of destruction closed in, they leapt through a collapsing doorway, tumbling into the void. For a moment, there was nothing and just the weightless sensation of falling through time itself. Then, with a sudden jolt, they were thrust into a new reality. The world around them was quiet. Ethan blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. They were no longer in the Eternal Fortress, no longer trapped in a collapsing timeline. Instead, they stood in a vast, open field, the sky above them painted with the soft hues of a setting sun. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze stirred the grass at their feet. Lara coughed, clutching her side where a piece of debris had grazed her. Ethan rushed to her side, helping her steady herself. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice rough from the strain of their escape. She nodded, though her face was pale. "I'll live." "What about you?" Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air was still, the world calm. "I think we made it," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "The Eternals are gone." Lara looked around, her eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting some remnant of the Eternals to appear. But there was nothing. The fortress, the timelines, the hunter set, it was all gone, erased by the destruction of the core. They were free. But as the reality of their situation sank in, so did the enormity of their actions. They had stopped the Eternals, yes, but in doing so, they had collapsed countless timelines. Entire versions of themselves, of humanity, had been wiped from existence. They were standing in a timeline that was, for all intents and purposes, foreign to them. "Where are we?" Lara asked, her voice quiet. Ethan didn't have an answer. He glanced around, noting the subtle differences in the landscape, the unfamiliar constellations beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I don't know," he admitted. "But wherever we are, it's a world without the Eternals." Lara sighed, a mixture of relief and exhaustion in her expression. "I guess that's all that matters." For a long moment, they stood in silence, taking in the peaceful scene around them. After everything they had been through, the stillness felt almost surreal. Ethan's mind was still reeling from the loss of the timelines they had traveled through, the lives they had seen flicker in and out of existence. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm, golden glow, he realized that they had done what they had set out to do. The Eternals, with all their power and cruelty, were no more. Humanity was safe from their hunt. And though the costs had been high, Ethan knew that they had made the right choice. "We'll figure it out," he said, turning to Lara with a small, reassuring smile. "This world, this time linear, it's ours now. We can build something here, start fresh." Lara returned the smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "We've been through so much. It feels strange to think about starting over." "Yeah," Ethan agreed, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "But maybe that's the point. After all we've seen, after all we've lost, maybe starting over is exactly what we need." They stood together as the first stars appeared in the night sky, a sense of quiet finality settling over them. The hunt was over, the timelines secured, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were free to choose their own path. Ethan glanced at Lara, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Let's go," he said softly. "We've got a whole new world to explore." And with that, they turned away from the remnants of the past, stepping into the future they had fought so hard to protect. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The planet was dead, its surface a barren wasteland of dust and jagged rock formations that reached like skeletal fingers toward the starless sky. The Argus touched down with a hiss of hydraulic legs on the only flat patch of land for miles. Captain Raina Steele, standing at the viewport, scanned the horizon with her hardened gaze. The landscape offered nothing but desolation. "Any signs of life?" she asked, her voice as sharp as the unforgiving terrain outside. "None, ma'am," replied Sergeant Elias Dunn from the control station. His fingers danced over the console, double-checking the environmental scans. "Atmosphere's breathable, but thin. No vegetation. No signs of intelligent life, either." Raina grunted. "Let's suit up anyway. No telling what we might run into out there." She turned and addressed the rest of the crew. "We go in, we grab the data, we get out." "Understood?" Her team nodded. Dr. Michael Harrow, the xenobiologist, was already fidgeting with his equipment, his eyes gleaming with the excitement of potential discovery. Technician Zoe Marlowe secured her tools, glancing nervously at the others. She was the youngest of the crew, and this was only her second deep space mission. Raina eyed her. "You all right, Marlowe?" "Yes, Captain," Zoe replied, though her voice betrayed her unease. Just a broken bar. I've read the reports on this sector. Not a lot of successful missions out here. Successful or not, we've got a job to do, Raina said, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. Let's move. The airlock hissed open, and the crew stepped out onto the planet's surface. The silence was oppressive, a void so complete that even the crunch of their boots seemed swallowed by the vast emptiness. A faint wind carried particles of dust, shimmering faintly under the glow of the distant sun. It was colder than expected, the chill cutting through their suits despite the planet's daytime temperature readings. As they moved out from the landing site, the looming structure in the distance came into focus. It was a labyrinthine complex, ancient and massive, rising out of the ground like a dormant beast. Alien symbols etched into its walls, their meaning long forgotten, pulsed faintly with a greenish light. Well, there it is, Dr. Harrow said, his voice tinged with awe. Never seen anything like it. Raina stared at the massive structure. It was both beautiful and menacing, like it had been grown rather than built, its stone surface smooth yet strangely organic. It looks like a trap, Zoe muttered. Everything out here is a trap, Raina replied, adjusting the settings on her helmet. But we didn't come all this way to admire the view. Dunn, take point. Sergeant Dunn nodded, unholstering his plasma rifle as he led the group toward the entrance. The doors were enormous, towering above them like the mouth of some sleeping giant. As they approached, the doors slid open with an unsettling smoothness, as though they had been waiting for someone to arrive. Convenient, Dunn muttered. Too convenient. Inside, the temperature dropped further, and the walls seemed to hum with a faint, electrical energy. Strange patterns covered every surface, constantly shifting in ways that made them hard to focus on. The corridors twisted in unexpected directions, some leading into dead ends while others looped back into the same rooms they had already passed. It's alive, Harrow whispered, running his hand along the cold, smooth stone. Not in the biological sense, but a broken bar. It's like it's thinking. Responding to us. Keep moving, Raina ordered, her eyes scanning for danger. Stay close. They moved deeper into the maze, each step more disorienting than the last. Harrow constantly scanned the air, detecting faint traces of organic material that shouldn't exist in such an environment. Dunn kept his weapon raised, his instincts screaming that something was off. Zoe's fingers trembled as she adjusted her scanner, the beeping faster and faster the further they went in. Captain, she called out, her voice shaking. I'm getting some strange readings. It's like the walls area broken bar reacting to us. Raina didn't respond. She was already aware, her senses on high alert. The walls seemed to close in, the corridors shifting almost imperceptibly, as though the structure itself was trying to confuse them. The air grew thicker, a staleness that made each breath feel heavier than the last. Suddenly, the floor beneath them shifted. Zoe screamed as the ground dropped out from under her feet, but Dunn lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her back just before she fell into the darkness below. The floor closed again, as if nothing had happened. Booby traps, Dunn said through gritted teeth, pulling Zoe to her feet. This place is full of them. No, Harrow said, shaking his head as he looked around in awe. It's not just traps. This place is a broken bar. It's aware of us. Raina's jaw clenched. We need to get to the center of this thing and get out. Dunn, keep an eye on her. Harrow, stay focused. They moved on, but the labyrinth seemed to be growing more hostile. The walls shifted behind them, sealing off their escape routes. The air grew colder, and strange, skittering noises echoed through the corridors, as if something was moving within the walls. What was that? Zoe whispered, clutching her scanner tightly. Probably just the wind, Dunn muttered, though he didn't believe it himself. They turned a corner and came to a massive chamber, its walls lined with alien glyphs that pulsed with energy. In the center was a large pedestal, on which rested an ancient, glowing orb. Harrow stepped forward, his eyes wide with wonder. This broken bar. This is incredible, he breathed, moving toward the pedestal. This could be the key to understanding this entire complex. Rhina grabbed his arm. Don't touch anything, we don't know what we're dealing with here. Harrow shook her off, his curiosity overwhelming his caution. Captain, this could be the discovery of a lifetime. We can't just leave it here. Before Rhina could stop him, Harrow reached out and placed his hand on the orb. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground rumbled, and the walls of the chamber shifted violently. The skittering sounds grew louder, closer. What did you do? Don shouted, raising his rifle as the lights in the room flickered and dimmed. "A broken bar, I don't know," Harrow stammered, stepping back from the pedestal as the orb began to pulse with a sickly green light. Suddenly, a section of the wall slid open, revealing a dark, narrow corridor leading deeper into the maze. From the darkness came a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something massive and heavy moving toward them. Rhina's heart pounded in her chest as she raised her weapon. "We need to move." Now, they ran, the sound of the creature growing louder behind them. The walls seemed to shift faster now, the maze closing in around them as though it were trying to guide them toward the beast. Dunn fired his plasma rifle down the corridor, but the shots seemed to disappear into the darkness, absorbed by the shifting walls. "Keep moving," Rhina shouted, leading the way through the twisting corridors. But the maze was relentless. No matter which direction they turned, the creature was always behind them, its growls echoing through the narrow passageways. "Captain, I don't think we're going to outrun this thing," Dunn called out, his voice strained with panic. Rhina's mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. The maze wasn't just a structure, it was a living trap, designed to keep them inside and lead them towards certain death. But why? What was the purpose of this place? As they rounded another corner, they came face to face with a massive, insectoid creature. Its body was covered in jagged, armored plates, and its many legs clicked and scraped against the floor as it moved toward them with terrifying speed. The creature's mandibles clicked together in a rhythmic, predatory sound as its dark eyes, far too many of them, fixed on Rhina and her team. Sergeant Dunn fired immediately, unleashing a barrage of plasma shots. The bright blue beams struck the creature's armored hide, but they barely left a mark. The plasma sizzled on the surface, illuminating the grotesque texture of the alien predator's exoskeleton, but it just kept advancing. "Fall back," Rhina shouted, yanking Harrow back by his jacket as the creature lunged forward. Its movements were swift and terrifyingly precise, its massive body navigating the narrow corridor with unnatural ease. They ran, but Rhina knew it was only a matter of time. The maze was alive, trapping them in an endless cycle of narrow passageways, dead ends, and chambers designed to confuse and mislead. She could feel some malevolent intelligence guiding them toward their doom. Every path they took seemed to lead them back toward the predator. "Captain, it's hurting us," Zoe gasped, barely keeping pace as they turned another corner only to find a wall sliding shut behind them. "This whole place is a trap." Rhina glanced back, watching as the walls seemed to shift of their own volition, closing in behind them like the jaws of a massive beast. "We need to outthink it," she said, scanning their surroundings. "We can't keep running blindly. There's got to be a way to stop this thing." Harrow, still reeling from the encounter with the alien orb, struggled to keep up. "The labyrinth, the broken bar, it was never meant for us. It's designed to trap that predator, not us. We're just a collateral damage." Rhina's mind raced. If the labyrinth was a prison, that meant there had to be some way to control it, some way to reactivate whatever ancient system had kept the creature confined for so long. But how? The alien technology was beyond anything they'd ever encountered. The maze was sentient, adapting to their every move, manipulating the environment to drive them into the predator's path. Another growl echoed through the labyrinth, sending a chill down Rhina's spine. The creature was close again, its massive form scraping along the walls as it hunted them. Dunn stopped, breathing hard as he looked down a narrow passage that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. "We can't keep running," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "We have to fight it." Rhina shook her head. "That thing's armor is too thick. We'd need explosives or..." Before she could finish, the ground beneath them began to tremble, the walls vibrating with a low, pulsating hum. Harrow's eyes widened in realization. It's reacting to the creature. The mez a broken bar, it's trying to retrap it. But we're in the way. Zoe's fingers flew over her scanner, trying to make sense of the labyrinth's shifting architecture. It's locking down sections, closing off access points. It wants to contain the predator, but we're too close to it. Rhina's eyes narrowed as she processed the information. The labyrinth was designed to imprison the creature, but it had been dormant for too long. Their presence had reactivated it, and now it was struggling to catch up, adapting to the threat but unable to distinguish between prey and predator. "We have to get ahead of it," Rhina said, determination hardening her voice. "If we can reach the control center, we can reinitiate the prison sequence, trap the creature before it gets to us." "How do we even know where the control center is?" Dunn asked, his rifle still trained on the corridor behind them. Rhina pointed to the alien glyphs lining the walls. "The symbols a broken bar there, a map." "Harrow, you're the expert. Can you read them?" Harrow stared at the shifting symbols, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I think a broken bar, yes. I think I can. But we have to move fast." "Then lead the way," Rhina said, her voice firm. Zoe stuck close to him. "Dunn, you and I will cover the rear." They moved quickly, Harrow guiding them through the twisting corridors using the alien glyphs as their only guide. The predator was close, its guttural growls echoing through the maze, but the labyrinth seemed to shift in their favor now, opening pathways just as quickly as it closed others. As they neared the heart of the labyrinth, the architecture grew more intricate, the walls lined with strange alien machines, dormant but humming with potential energy. Harrow's pace quickened, his eyes wide with both fear and fascination. "There!" he shouted, pointing to a massive door at the end of the corridor. "That's the control center. It has to be." Rhina wasted no time. "Dunn, get that door open." "We'll hold it off." Dunn nodded, rushing forward to pry open the massive, ancient door. Rhina and Zoe took up defensive positions, their weapons trained on the corridor behind them. The predator was too close. The ground shook as the creature rounded the corner, its many eyes gleaming in the dim light. It let out a screeching roar, its mandibles snapping as it charged toward them. Rhina fired, but the plasma shots barely slowed it down. "Come on, Dunn." "I'm working on it," Dunn shouted, his muscles straining as he pried open the door. It creaked loudly, the alien mechanisms protesting as they were forced back into motion. The predator lunged forward, its claws slashing through the air. Rhina barely dodged the attack, the creature's razor-sharp limbs scraping against the walls with a deafening screech. Zoe fired her weapon, hitting the creature in one of its many eyes. It screeched in pain, recoiling for a moment, but it wasn't enough to stop it. "Done!" Rhina shouted, her voice desperate. The door finally gave way, sliding open with a loud hiss. "Go, get inside!" They rushed into the control room just as the creature lunged again, its massive body slamming into the doorframe. Rhina hit the control panel, and the door slammed shut, trapping the predator outside. For now, inside, the control room was vast, filled with alien technology that hummed with an eerie, ancient energy. Harrow immediately went to work, deciphering the controls. "This is it," he muttered, his fingers flying over the alien interface. "If I can reactivate the system, we can trap it." "Hurry," Rhina said, her eyes never leaving the door. She could hear the predator outside, its claws scraping against the metal, trying to find a way in. Harrow's hands shook as he worked, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "It's more complicated than I thought. A broken bar. This technology is ancient, but it's a broken bar. It's so advanced." "We don't have time for admiration," Dunn snapped, his rifle still trained on the door. "Just get it done." The room trembled as the labyrinth shifted again, the walls creaking and groaning under the strain of the predator's presence. "Almost a broken bar there," Harrow shouted, slamming his hand down on the final control. A low hum filled the room, and the labyrinth's architecture began to change. The walls shifted, sealing off corridors and locking down sections of the maze. The lights flickered, then turned a deep red, as if the entire structure was going into full lockdown. Outside, the predator screeched in fury as the walls closed in around it, trapping it in a section of the maze designed to contain it. Rhina could hear the creature's desperate roars as the ancient prison finally reactivated. "It's done," Harrow said, his voice shaky with relief. "The labyrinth is re-engaged. The creature's trapped." Rhina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Good work." But before they could celebrate, the ground shook violently. The walls trembled, cracks forming in the ceiling. "What's happening?" Zoe asked, her voice panicked. "The system's unstable," Harrow said, his face pale. "It's been dormant for too long. Reactivating it has destabilized the entire structure." "We need to get out of here," Dunn said, already moving toward the door. Raina nodded. "Move." Now, they ran through the collapsing corridors, the labyrinth crumbling around them. The walls shifted, but now it was chaos, no longer controlled, no longer sentient. It was simply falling apart. The Argus was in sight, its landing lights glowing faintly through the dust and debris. They sprinted for the ship, their lungs burning, their legs screaming in exhaustion. Behind them, the labyrinth collapsed in on itself, a massive cloud of dust and debris rising into the air as the ancient structure crumbled under the strain of centuries of neglect. They made it to the ship just as the ground shook with a final, violent tremor. Rhina collapsed into the pilot's seat, her chest heaving as she activated the engines. The Argus lifted off, the thrusters roaring to life as they left the collapsing planet behind. In the distance, the labyrinth was no more, swallowed by the dust of the planet, along with the predator that had been trapped there for millennia. Raina stared at the screen in front of her, watching as the desolate planet grew smaller and smaller. They had survived, but the cost had been high. "Do you think a broken bar there are more out there?" Zoe asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Raina didn't answer. She didn't need to. The universe was vast, filled with secrets, with dangers they couldn't even begin to comprehend. But for now, they had escaped one of them, and that would have to be enough. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The sky above Serapis was a sickly green, the remnants of a planet long forgotten by time, its glory buried under layers of dust and decaying structures. The ancient empire that once ruled here was nothing more than a distant echo, its achievements and culture reduced to ruins. For Dr. Evelyn Marks, an archaeologist from Earth, this desolation was a treasure trove. Every crumbling building, every cracked obelisk was a piece of the puzzle that could unlock the secrets of an empire lost to history. She just didn't realize that some secrets should remain buried. Her footsteps echoed through the hollow corridors of the ancient temple. The air was thick, stale from millennia of abandonment. Yet there was something else, something unsettling that clung to the atmosphere. As she scanned the walls, her flashlight revealed intricate carvings. The figures etched into the stone seemed to writhe in the dim light, depicting scenes of a once flourishing civilization. Among them were ominous creatures, towering figures that loomed over the empire's citizens. "Jonah, come take a look at this," Evelyn called out, her voice muffled by the silence. Jonah Reeves, her assistant and the team's data analyst, appeared at her side. He was younger, less seasoned, but sharp. His dark eyes flicked from the carvings to the dusty floor, noticing the strange patterns beneath their feet. "What do you make of it?" she asked, brushing her fingertips against the stone. The figures depicted looked monstrous, half organic, half mechanical. It was as if the very essence of life had been twisted into something unnatural. Jonah squinted, taking out his portable scanner. "I'm not sure. Could be ceremonial, maybe something to do with their religious beliefs." Evelyn frowned, her mind churning. She had spent years studying the remnants of this empire, but nothing in the historical record had prepared her for what she saw. These creatures these destroyers say were different. There was something sinister about them, something that didn't belong in the narrative of a once glorious civilization. I don't think this was a religious figure, she said softly. This was something else. Before Jonah could respond, a static buzz erupted from their comms, breaking the eerie silence. "Dr. Marks, you need to come back to the base camp," came the voice of Captain Harris, their security lead. "We've picked up a signal." Something unusual. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Jonah, her pulse quickening. They had been on this mission for weeks, uncovering remnants of the Empire but finding little that could explain its abrupt downfall. A signal could mean anything: a surviving technology, or worse, something alive. "We'll be right there," Evelyn replied, motioning for Jonah to follow her out of the temple. As they made their way through the decaying corridors, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The walls seemed to close in on them, the oppressive silence making every footstep feel like a drumbeat. Jonah walked beside her, fidgeting with his scanner, but she could see the tension in his face. He felt it too, the sense that they had stirred something long forgotten. When they reached the base camp, a collection of tents and scientific equipment nestled at the edge of the temple ruins, Captain Harris was already waiting for them. A no-nonsense military man, Harris had seen his share of strange things in the galaxy, but even he looked uneasy. "What's the signal?" Evelyn asked. Harris nodded toward the comm station. "It's coming from deep within the ruins. Some kind of automated beacon. We thought this place was dead, but now a broken bar. It's like something woke up." Evelyn stared at the monitor, her mind racing. Ancient empires didn't leave beacons running for millennia unless they were warning something or someone. She turned to Jonah. "Can you isolate it? Pinpoint the location?" Jonah nodded, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Give me a minute." As the data streamed across the screen, Evelyn's heart pounded. Something about this felt wrong. Deeply wrong. She had read enough history to know that some ruins were better left untouched. Empires that fell rarely did so peacefully, and the alien civilization that once dominated Serapis had vanished with terrifying suddenness. "There," Jonah said, pointing at the screen. "It's coming from a chamber about a mile east of here, beneath the ruins of what looks like a fortress." "A fortress?" Harris repeated, his brows furrowing. This place was a capital city, not a military outpost. Evelyn shook her head, her thoughts churning. "We need to go. There might be answers there." Harris hesitated, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his chest. "Dr. Marks, are you sure that's a good idea? We don't know what triggered that signal, and we're not equipped to handle anything a broken bar dangerous." Evelyn knew the risks, but the lure of uncovering the truth was too great. "We came here for answers, Captain. We can't stop now." Harris sighed, nodding reluctantly. "All right, but we go in fully armed." The journey to the fortress was treacherous, the ruins more labyrinthine as they approached the eastern edge of the city. The wind howled through broken spires and jagged rock formations, carrying with it the distant echoes of the Empire's final days. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far older, far deadlier than they had anticipated. When they reached the entrance to the fortress, it was clear that time had not been kind to the structure. Massive stone doors, covered in centuries of dust and debris, loomed before them. Carvings similar to those in the temple adorned the entrance, depicting the same monstrous figure as the destroyers, as the data logs had referred to them. Jonah worked to unlock the sealed entrance, his fingers trembling slightly. "It's ancient, but the locking mechanism is still operational. This fortress must have been important to keep this intact." With a groan, the massive doors slid open, revealing a dark, gaping void beyond. The air inside was cold, a biting chill that felt unnatural, even for a planet long abandoned. Their flashlights pierced the darkness, illuminating a narrow corridor leading deeper into the fortress. As they ventured inside, the walls grew tighter, and the air thicker. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional hum of distant machinery. Something was alive in this place, something old, something waiting. Evelyn's heart raced as they descended deeper into the fortress, the walls around them shifting from stone to sleek, ancient metal. The deeper they went, the more the structure resembled a containment facility rather than a fortress. "Dr. Marks, take a look at this," Jonah called out, his voice barely above a whisper. Ahead of them, at the end of the corridor, stood a massive containment chamber. It was sealed, the walls covered in strange alien script. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and even Harris, who had faced death countless times, looked uneasy. "This is it," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is what they were trying to keep hidden." Without warning, the chamber's lights flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the room. Alarms began to blare, the sound reverberating through the fortress. Something had been triggered, something ancient, something dangerous. "Fall back!" Harris shouted, raising his weapon as the containment door began to open. But it was too late. The creature that emerged from the chamber was like nothing they had ever seen, a hulking, grotesque, a monstrous fusion of alien biology and mechanical technology. Its body was covered in jagged, metal-like armor, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural, hungry light. It was a destroyer, one of the Empire's greatest weapons, now awakened and ready to hunt. Before they could react, the creature lunged, moving with terrifying speed. It ripped through one of the security officers, its claws slicing through armor and flesh with ease. Blood sprayed across the walls, the air thick with the scent of death. "Run!" Evelyn screamed, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the alarms. They fled, their footsteps echoing through the corridors as the destroyer pursued them with relentless determination. It was faster, stronger, and far more intelligent than they could have ever imagined. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly as they ran, the sound of their labored breathing mingling with the relentless pounding of the destroyer's footsteps behind them. Evelyn's heart was racing, every instinct screaming at her to get out, to find safety. But there was no safety here. They had awakened something that had been slumbering for millennia, and now wanted them dead. Harris led the way, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. Jonah was right behind Evelyn, his breath ragged as they darted around a corner and into a wider hall. The moment they burst through the door, Harris slammed it shut, his hands shaking as he jammed the locking mechanism. "That thing a broken bar, it's unstoppable," Jonah gasped, doubling over as he tried to catch his breath. Evelyn glanced back at the door, the heavy thudding of the destroyer growing louder. It was only a matter of time before it broke through. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We have to find another way out." Harris nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We need to head back to the ship. Get to high ground, maybe we can." Before he could finish, the door buckled. Metal screeched, and the entire frame bent inward as the destroyer's massive claws punched through. It was coming for them. "Fast! Move!" Harris barked, shoving Jonah forward as they bolted down the hall. Evelyn's mind raced as they ran. The creature, they called it a destroyer, but it was more than just a mindless killing machine. It had intelligence. It was hunting them, stalking them, learning from every encounter. And if the logs were right, this was only the beginning. There were more. They sprinted through the labyrinth of corridors, the sounds of destruction growing fainter behind them. But Evelyn knew it wouldn't last. The fortress was massive, but it wasn't a sanctuary. The destroyer would find them again. It was only a matter of time. Ahead, the corridor opened up into a massive chamber. Ancient consoles lined the walls, each one flickering weakly with power. The room was dominated by a large, central terminal, its interface covered in the strange alien script they had seen throughout the ruins. "This must be the control center," Jonah muttered, his voice barely a whisper as he looked around. Evelyn approached the terminal, her fingers trembling as she wiped the dust from its surface. The alien script was familiar now, After hours of poring over the logs and records they had recovered, she understood enough to know that this terminal controlled the containment system. It was designed to keep the destroyers locked away. But something had gone wrong. The failsafe had failed. "We need to find a way to shut it down," Evelyn said, her voice tight with urgency. "There has to be a way to stop it." Jonah moved to the nearest console, his hands flying over the controls as he tried to access the system. "It's still operational," a broken bar barely. "But I think I can." His voice cut off as the ground shook beneath them. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the walls seemed to tremble as if the entire fortress were groaning under the strain of the ancient technology. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. The destroyer was close. "Jonah, we don't have time," Harris growled, his eyes darting toward the door. "I'm working as fast as I can," Jonah snapped, his hands shaking as he continued typing. The console flickered, and then a stream of data began scrolling across the screen. "Got it. There's a failsafe system. It's supposed to deactivate the destroyers." "Do it," Evelyn urged, her eyes fixed on the door. Jonah's fingers moved faster, navigating the ancient interface with desperate precision. Finally, with a triumphant click, he activated the sequence. The room hummed with energy, and for a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to hope. But then the system flickered and died. "No, no, no!" Jonah cried, slamming his fist against the console. "It's not working. The power's too low. The system's failing." A low growl echoed from the corridor, and Evelyn's blood ran cold. The destroyer had found them. Harris raised his rifle, his face grim. "We need to move now." They bolted from the control room, their footsteps echoing through the ancient halls as they raced against time. The fortress seemed to shift around them, the walls twisting in the dim light as if the structure itself was alive, watching them. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as they ran, her mind spinning with the weight of their situation. The failsafe had failed. There was no way to deactivate the destroyers, no way to stop them from hunting. And worse, she realized, there was more than one. "This can't be happening," Jonah whispered, his voice filled with dread. "We're trapped." "We're not trapped," Harris growled. "We just need to get back to the ship." Evelyn wasn't sure if that was even possible anymore. The fortress was vast, and the path they had taken had twisted and turned so many times she wasn't sure they could find their way back. But there was no other choice. They had to try. The sound of the destroyer grew louder, closer. Its heavy footsteps thudded against the stone floors, relentless in its pursuit. Evelyn glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding as she saw the shadow of the creature rounding the corner behind them. It was faster than before, more determined. It had learned. "Faster!" Harris shouted, his voice thick with panic. They rounded another corner, the narrow passageways of the fortress disorienting them with every turn. Evelyn could barely see in front of her, the dim light from her flashlight flickering as they ran. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Ahead, a light appeared at the end of the corridor. It was faint, but it was their only hope. "The exit." "We're almost there," Jonah cried, his voice filled with desperate relief. But as they neared the exit, the ground shook again, and a deafening roar filled the air. The destroyer lunged from the shadows, its massive claws swiping through the air as it barreled toward them. Harris turned, his rifle blazing with rapid gunfire. The bullets tore into the creature, but it barely slowed. It was unstoppable, a force of nature that couldn't be contained. Evelyn's heart sank as she watched Harris stand his ground, his face set with grim determination. He wasn't going to make it. "Go!" Harris shouted, his voice filled with fury as he unloaded his weapon into the advancing creature. "Get out of here!" Evelyn and Jonah didn't hesitate. They sprinted toward the exit, their hearts pounding in their chests as the sound of the destroyer's growl filled the air. Harris's gunfire echoed behind them, but it wasn't enough. They both knew it wasn't enough. The moment they burst through the exit and into the open air, the world seemed to blur around them. The planet's strange green sky stretched above them, casting an eerie glow over the desolate ruins. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Behind them, they heard Harris's final scream. Then silence. Evelyn's heart ached, but there was no time to mourn. She and Jonah ran through the ruins, their footsteps kicking up dust as they raced toward the distant silhouette of their ship. It was their only chance of survival, their only hope of escaping this nightmare. As they neared the ship, Jonah's breath hitched, and he stumbled, falling to his knees. I can't a broken bar. Evelyn grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. You can. We have to make it. The ground shook again, and they both turned to see the destroyer emerging from the ruins. It had followed them, relentless in its pursuit. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and it let out a deafening roar, its body heaving with the effort of its hunt. We're not going to make it, Jonah whispered, his voice hollow. We will, Evelyn said, her voice firm, though fear gnawed at her insides. They reached the ship, the ramp already down. Evelyn shoved Jonah inside, her heart pounding as she turned to face the destroyer one last time. It was close, too close. She could see the madness in its eyes, the raw hunger for destruction. Without thinking, she slammed the ramp control, sealing the ship as the creature barreled toward them. The moment the door shut, she collapsed to the ground, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. Jonah scrambled to the cockpit, his hands trembling as he activated the ship's engines. We need to get out of here. Now. The ship roared to life, lifting off the ground as the destroyer's claws scraped against the hull. But it was too late for the creature. As the ship ascended into the sky, Evelyn watched as the planet below grew smaller, the ruins fading into the distance. For now, they were safe. But the destroyer was still out there, and Evelyn knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning.